The silence in the Cedar Rapids Community Center hung like a physical weight. Marshal Reynolds stood frozen at the entrance, his weathered hand trembling against the doorframe. Across the room, lying motionless on a worn plaid blanket, was Ranger. Once a magnificent German shepherd capable of chasing down criminals, now a gray-muzzled shadow of himself. "He might not remember you," Jennifer Simmons whispered, her eyes betraying doubt. Marshall's throat tightened. 7 years, 7 birthdays, Christmases, seasons. Would loyalty survive time's cruel erasure? The old man straightened his back, squared his shoulders like he'd done countless times before facing danger. With voice steady but heart racing, he called out, "Ranger! Berate!" Time suspended. 20 pairs of eyes darted between man and dog. Ranger's ears, once alert sentinels, now drooping with age, suddenly perked up. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Marshal Reynolds hadn't always been a man who measured his words. 30 years with the Cedar Rapids Police Department had taught him the value of precision, of saying exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. But retirement had turned him quiet, a shadow moving through empty rooms in his small Des Moines apartment. At 68, his tall frame had begun to stoop, though his eyes remained sharp beneath bushy gray eyebrows. His hands, once steady enough to defuse a bomb, now sometimes trembled when he reached for his morning coffee. The doctors called it essential tremor. Marshall called it getting old. The walls of his apartment told the story his lips rarely did. Shadow boxes displaying badges, commendations, and photographs. Most prominent was a framed photo of Marshall in his prime, standing tall beside a magnificent German shepherd with alert ears and intelligent eyes. Ranger, badge, K9’s, the finest partner he'd ever had. Their partnership had been legendary in the department. 236 successful arrests, 14 officer assists, and more than $3 million in narcotics seized. Ranger could find drugs hidden in the most ingenious places, track suspects through impossible terrain, and had saved Marshall's life twice. Not that Marshall kept count. Across town, in a modest Cape Cod home with a fenced yard, Jennifer Simmons was brushing an old German shepherd whose hindquarters trembled with each movement. At 62, Jennifer was a widow with kind eyes and practical hands. She'd never been a police officer, never trained a working dog, but 7 years ago she'd agreed to take in a retired K9 who needed a quiet place to spend his golden years. "You're a good boy, Ranger," she murmured, gently working through a tangle in his fur. The dog's muzzle had gone completely white and cataracts clouded his once sharp eyes, but he leaned into her touch with the trust of long companionship. Robert Thompson, the current chief of police, sat behind his desk reviewing cold cases. At 55, Thompson had risen through the ranks quickly, his ambition matched only by his political savvy. A framed photo on his desk showed him shaking hands with the governor. He glanced at the calendar, noting the date, and frowned slightly before closing the file labeled Rodriguez 2016 inactive. Meanwhile, William Reynolds was finishing his shift at Cedar Rapids Memorial Hospital, where he worked as an emergency room doctor. At 42, he had his father's height and his mother's gentle eyes, but none of his father's rigid discipline. The relationship with his father had been strained for decades, fractured by the same dedication to duty that had made Marshall a decorated officer and a distant father. Doctor. Sarah Collins checked her watch as she finished notes on her last patient of the day, a retired police K9 with advanced hip dysplasia and a recently discovered mass that concerned her greatly. As the leading veterinarian for working animals in the region, she had seen countless service dogs through their careers and into retirement. This case, however, was complicated by more than medical issues. What connected these 5 lives was about to resurface after 7 years of silence, beginning with a phone call that would change everything. Marshall woke with a start, sheets damp with sweat despite the cool May morning. The same dream again. Ranger looking back at him from the Simmons driveway, confusion in those intelligent eyes as Marshall forced himself to walk away without a backward glance. 7 years hadn't dulled the edge of that memory. "You're doing what's best for him," the department psychologist had assured him. "Clean breaks heal better. But some breaks never heal right. They just stop hurting quite so much." Marshall swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing as his right knee protested. Old injuries from the job made themselves known with every weather change. He'd once kept meticulous track of barometric pressure drops by how much his knee ached. These days, he just accepted the pain as part of waking up. The morning routine hadn't varied in years. Coffee first, strong enough to stand a spoon in, then 2 pieces of toast with strawberry jam, Linda's favorite, though she'd been gone 3 years now. The small television in the kitchen corner murmured the morning news while Marshall stared out the window at the bird feeder he'd installed last summer. His phone rarely rang anymore. Most of his old colleagues had either retired to warmer climates or passed away. His son William called dutifully every other Sunday, their conversations awkward and filled with long pauses. Marshall's granddaughter Emma sometimes sent text messages with photos he couldn't quite figure out how to save. So when the phone rang at 8:17 a.m., Marshall stared at it as though it were a snake that had somehow slithered onto his kitchen counter. "Reynolds," he answered, falling back on 30 years of habit. "Officer Reynolds." A woman's voice, vaguely familiar. "This is Jennifer Simmons." Marshall's hand tightened around the phone. 7 years dissolved in an instant. "Mrs. Simmons." His voice remained steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Is everything all right?" A pause, then a small sound that might have been a suppressed sob. "It's about Ranger." Marshall lowered himself slowly into a kitchen chair, suddenly uncertain his legs would support him. "Is he—" "He's alive," Jennifer said quickly. "But I think you should know. The vet says he has maybe 3 months. Cancer. It's spread to his lungs." Marshall closed his eyes. He had prepared himself over the years for the inevitable phone call telling him Ranger had passed peacefully in his sleep. Not this. Not a countdown. "I'm sorry to hear that," he managed, the words inadequate even to his own ears. "There's something else," Jennifer continued. "My husband Carl passed away last winter. I'm selling the house, moving to Arizona to be near my sister." "I can't," her voice broke. "I can't take him with me, and I can't bear the thought of him spending his last months with strangers." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. "Mrs. Simmons, please call me Jennifer." "Jennifer," Marshall corrected himself. "My circumstances haven't changed. I'm still in an apartment that doesn't allow pets. And at my age—" He trailed off, not wanting to admit his own limitations. "There's going to be a small gathering," Jennifer pressed on. "Next week. Some of the other K9 officers are coming by, people who knew Ranger. It would mean a lot if you could be there. To say goodbye, at least." Marshall's throat tightened. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "Please," Jennifer said. "I think he remembers you. Sometimes he sits by the window when a police car drives by, like he's waiting." After he hung up, Marshall sat motionless at the kitchen table, cold coffee forgotten. The K9 Veterans Advocacy Group he'd been volunteering with had been pushing for legislation to allow retired K9s to remain with their handlers. Too late for Ranger, but maybe not for others. He'd drafted letters, made phone calls, shared his story without ever mentioning how much it had cost him to walk away that day. The department's policy had been clear. K9s were equipment, and upon retirement, they were to be rehomed to suitable families. Officers couldn't keep their partners. It created liability issues. Marshall snorted. Liability issues. As if he and Ranger hadn't faced armed suspects together, hadn't tracked missing children through storm drains, hadn't survived the Rodriguez warehouse fire by the skin of their teeth. By noon, Marshall had made his decision. He called the Cedar Rapids Police Department asking to speak with his old sergeant, only to learn the man had retired years ago. Instead, he was connected to Chief Thompson. "Reynolds," Thompson said, his tone carefully neutral. "Been a long time." "Need to visit the old stomping grounds," Marshall said, keeping his voice casual. "Passing through next week. Thought I'd stop by, see how things have changed." A pause. "Any particular reason for the visit?" Marshall considered lying, then discarded the idea. "Jennifer Simmons called. Ranger's not doing well." Another pause, longer this time. "I heard. Shame about that. Good dog." "I'd like to see him. Pay my respects." "Of course." Thompson's voice softened slightly. "When will you be in town?" They settled the details, and Marshall hung up, unable to shake the feeling that something in Thompson's tone had been off. But then, the man had always been politically minded, more concerned with appearances than with the actual work of policing. The drive from Des Moines to Cedar Rapids took just under 2 hours, but for Marshall, it felt like traveling back in time. He passed landmarks that triggered cascades of memories: the truck stop where he and Ranger had apprehended a fugitive, the rest area where they'd trained for narcotics detection, the bridge where they'd once stopped a jumper together. The police station looked smaller than he remembered, its brick facade showing its age despite recent renovations. Marshall sat in his car for several minutes, gathering his courage. He hadn't set foot in the building since his retirement 5 years ago. The front desk sergeant was a young woman Marshall didn't recognize. She looked up with professional courtesy that turned to confusion when he introduced himself. "Reynolds? The K9 handler?" Her eyes widened slightly. "My dad used to work with you." "Officer Davis?" Marshall smiled, genuinely this time. "Tommy Davis. How is he?" "Retired last year, fishing mostly." She glanced around, then lowered her voice. "He talks about you and Ranger all the time, the Rodriguez case. Says you two were heroes." Before Marshall could respond, a voice called from across the lobby. "Reynolds! I thought that was you." Chief Thompson strode forward, hand extended, smile firmly in place. He'd gained weight since Marshall had seen him last, his uniform straining slightly at the buttons. "Chief," Marshall shook his hand. "Thanks for seeing me on short notice." Of course. Come back to my office. We can catch up." Marshall followed, noting the changes in the building. New equipment, fresh paint, different faces. A display case near the briefing room caught his eye. Photos of the department's K9 unit through the years. He paused, scanning for a familiar face, but found none. "We moved the K9 memorial to the new training facility," Thompson said, following his gaze. "More room out there." Thompson's office was larger than Marshall remembered, with a view of the park across the street. Awards and commendations lined the walls, along with photos of Thompson shaking hands with various politicians. "So," Thompson settled behind his desk, "retirement treating you well?" They exchanged the expected pleasantries, carefully avoiding any topics of substance until Thompson glanced at his watch. "Sorry to cut this short, but I've got a budget meeting in 5. You're here about Ranger, I understand?" Marshall nodded. "Jennifer Simmons called, said he's not doing well." Thompson's expression softened slightly. "Cancer, I heard. Tough break. She's having some kind of gathering?" "Next week. I thought I'd pay my respects." Thompson nodded slowly. "Good. That's good." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "You know, policies have changed since your time. K9s can retire with their handlers now. Too late for you and Ranger, of course, but progress, right?" Marshall felt a flare of anger, but kept his expression neutral. Better late than never. As he was leaving, Officer Davis's daughter caught him by the arm. My dad would kill me if he knew you were here and I didn't tell you. He's having coffee at Maggie's diner down the street. Says he needs to talk to you. Marshall found Tommy Davis at a corner booth, older and grayer but still with the same shrewd eyes Marshall remembered. They embraced briefly, then sat across from each other. Heard you were coming to town, Davis said without preamble. Ranger's sick, Marshall nodded. Terminal, from what Jennifer says. Davis glanced around the diner, then leaned forward. Things aren't what they seem, Marsh. With Ranger, with that whole situation. What do you mean? Not here. Davis slid a napkin across the table. My address. Come by tonight. There's some things you should know before you see that dog again. Marshall pocketed the napkin, curiosity and unease battling within him. Tommy? What's going on? Davis shook his head. Just trust me on this one. Some old ghosts are better left buried, but since you're digging, he sighed. Just come by tonight and watch your back. Cedar Rapids isn't as friendly to Marshall Reynolds as it used to be. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow that seemed to emphasize every wrinkle on Marshall's face. He hesitated at the doorway, scanning the small gathering. About 20 people stood in awkward clusters. Some faces he recognized from the department, others strangers who must be Jennifer's friends and neighbors. And there, in the center of the room, on a plaid blanket that had seen better days, lay Ranger. Marshall's heart squeezed painfully in his chest. The powerful, sleek animal he remembered had been replaced by an elderly dog with a gray muzzle and cloudy eyes. Ranger's once muscular frame had thinned, and Marshall could see a slight tremor in his hind legs, the hip dysplasia that had contributed to his early retirement. He's been waiting for you. Marshall turned to find Jennifer Simmons at his elbow. She'd aged well in 7 years, her face lined but kind, her posture still straight despite her 60-plus years. I wasn't sure I should come, Marshall admitted. Jennifer smiled sadly. I understand, but I'm glad you did. She nodded toward Ranger. He's having a good day today. The medication helps with the pain. Marshall swallowed hard. Does he? He couldn't finish the question. Does he remember you? Jennifer's eyes softened. I don't know. He's an old dog now. His memory isn't what it used to be. Taking a deep breath, Marshall crossed the room. Conversations quieted as people recognized him, heads turning to watch the reunion. The weight of their expectations pressed on his shoulders like a physical burden. He stopped a few feet from Ranger, suddenly unsure. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't even lifted his head to acknowledge the newcomer. Perhaps this had been a mistake, after all. They say dogs never forget a scent, someone murmured behind him. Marshall knelt slowly, his right knee protesting the movement. Ranger, he said softly. No response. Jennifer appeared at his side. He's a little deaf now, she explained. You have to speak up. Marshall cleared his throat. Ranger, he called, louder this time. The dog's ears twitched slightly, but his eyes remained closed. Marshall felt a lump forming in his throat. Maybe it had been too long. Maybe some bonds could be broken by time and distance. He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the small object he'd brought. Ranger's original ID tag, which he'd kept all these years despite department regulations requiring its return. Try the command, Jennifer suggested. The special one you mentioned on the phone. Marshall straightened his back, summoning the authority that had once been second nature. Ranger Berit! The German command, ready, had been their signal for the most serious situations when absolute focus was required. Marshall had chosen it specifically because it wasn't used by other handlers. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, Ranger's ears perked up. His eyes opened, still cloudy with cataracts but suddenly alert. His head lifted, nose working to catch a scent. The room collectively held its breath. Ranger struggled to his feet, wobbling slightly as his hind legs found their balance. His gaze fixed on Marshall, head tilting in that familiar questioning way that had always made Marshall think the dog understood far more than anyone gave him credit for. "It's me, boy," Marshall said, his voice breaking. "It's me." For 3 heartbeats, Ranger stood motionless. Then, with a sound that was half whine and half bark, he lurched forward. Marshall opened his arms just in time to catch the old dog as Ranger pressed against him, trembling with emotion or perhaps just the effort of standing. Marshall buried his face in the familiar fur, breathing in the scent that transported him back 7 years in an instant. "I missed you," he whispered. "God, I missed you." Around them, several people wiped away tears. Jennifer's hand covered her mouth, her eyes shining. "I've never seen him like this," she said to no one in particular. "Not in 7 years." Ranger whined again, pressing closer, his tail wagging weakly but persistently. Marshall ran his hands along the dog's sides, feeling the prominent ribs, the knots of old scar tissue, the tumor that bulged beneath the skin near his left shoulder. Evidence of time's passage, of battles fought without him. "I'm sorry," Marshall murmured. "I'm so sorry I left you." For nearly 10 minutes, man and dog remained locked in reunion, oblivious to the crowd around them. Ranger refused to leave Marshall's side, leaning heavily against his leg when standing became too difficult, accepting gentle scratches behind ears that had once been alert sentinels, but now drooped with age. "He remembers," Jennifer said finally, kneeling beside them. "After all this time?" Marshall nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Jennifer touched his arm gently. "There's something I need to discuss with you. In private." They moved to a quiet corner, Ranger hobbling beside Marshall, unwilling to be separated again. "I'm moving to Arizona next month," Jennifer explained. "My sister's there. After Carl died." She shook her head. "This house has too many memories." "I understand," Marshall said, though his eyes never left Ranger. "The thing is," Jennifer continued, "I can't take him with me. My sister's complex doesn't allow pets, especially large ones, and with his condition—" "What will happen to him?" Marshall asked, though he already knew the answer. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "The vet says he's suffering. The kindest thing might be to—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Marshall felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The thought of Ranger being put down, of life leaving those intelligent eyes while Marshall was once again absent, was unbearable. "Unless," Jennifer said carefully, "someone else could take him, for whatever time he has left." The implication hung in the air between them. "My apartment doesn't allow—" Marshall began. "I know," Jennifer interrupted. "You mentioned that. But I've been thinking, would it be possible for you to make other arrangements? Just temporarily?" Marshall stared down at Ranger, who had settled against his foot, head resting on Marshall's shoe as if afraid he might disappear again. "I don't know," he admitted. "My son, well, we're not close, and I don't have the space or the money for a different place right now." Jennifer nodded, disappointment evident in her expression. "I understand. It was just a thought." The gathering continued around them, people sharing stories about Ranger's service, his quirks, the lives he had touched. Marshall remained beside him, soaking in each moment, knowing it might be their last time together. As the afternoon wore on, Ranger grew tired, his eyelids drooping, his breathing becoming labored. Marshall helped him back to his plaid blanket, settling him comfortably. "I should go," Marshall said finally. "Let him rest." "Will you come back?" Jennifer asked. "Before I leave town? To say goodbye properly?" Marshall nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He leaned down to stroke Ranger's head one last time, memorizing the feel of his fur, the pattern of gray around his muzzle. "Be good, partner," he whispered. "I'll see you soon." He had almost reached the door when a commotion behind him made him turn. A tall, dark-haired man in scrubs had entered through a side door and was staring at Marshall with an expression that mingled disbelief and anger. "Dad," the man said. "What the hell are you doing here?" Marshall straightened, shock giving way to recognition. "William." "I didn't expect to see you." William Reynolds crossed the room in long strides, positioning himself between his father and the exit. At 42, he was in his prime, his resemblance to a younger Marshall striking, despite the coldness in his eyes. "Jennifer called me," William explained tersely. "Said you might be making a decision that affects our family. I had to see for myself." Marshall glanced back at Jennifer, who looked away guiltily. "It's not what you think, Will." "No." William's voice rose slightly. "It looks exactly like what I think. 7 years later, and you're still choosing that dog over your family." Several people nearby turned to stare, conversations faltering. "This isn't the place," Marshall said quietly. "We can discuss this outside." "Why bother?" William's bitter laugh held no humor. "It's the same conversation we've been having my whole life. Your work, your partner, your cases, always more important than Mom, than me, than your granddaughter who barely knows you." Marshall felt the familiar mixture of guilt and defensive anger rising. "That's not fair, and you know it." "Not fair?" William stepped closer. "You know what's not fair. Mom spending her last years allergic and miserable because you couldn't bear to be separated from your K9. You promising to retire, to be present, and then volunteering for every dangerous assignment that came along." "I was doing my job," Marshall protested. "Your job," William repeated. "Your precious job." "Well, Dad, your job nearly got you killed more times than I can count. It put Mom through hell. And now what? You're thinking of taking in a dying dog when you can barely take care of yourself?" The harsh words hung in the air between them. Marshall noticed Jennifer approaching cautiously, concern etched on her face. "Will," she began, "this isn't what I intended when I called you." William turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "I know, Jennifer, but someone has to be the voice of reason here." From across the room came a low whine. All three turned to see Ranger struggling to his feet again, his gaze fixed on the confrontation. "Look at him," William said more quietly. "He's suffering, Dad. Taking him now wouldn't be kindness. It would be selfish." Marshall watched as Ranger made his painful way across the room toward them, determination evident in every labored step. "Do you know why I couldn't keep him when he retired?" Marshall asked suddenly. "The real reason?" William frowned. "Mom's allergies." "That was part of it," Marshall acknowledged. "But not all." He gestured to Ranger, who had reached them and was leaning heavily against his leg again. 7 years ago, this dog saved my life. Not just by doing his job, but by disobeying a direct order." William's expression flickered with surprise. "What are you talking about?" Marshall closed his eyes briefly, the memory washing over him. "The Rodriguez warehouse. I never told you the details. Never told anyone except the review board. The drug bust that went bad," William said slowly. "You got a commendation for that." "We got a commendation," Marshall corrected. "Ranger and I. But what happened in that warehouse?" He shook his head. "I ordered Ranger to stay when I heard movement inside. Standard procedure. Secure the K9, assess the threat. But he refused, broke from his hold position and charged past me into the building." Marshall's hand dropped to Ranger's head, scratching gently behind one ear. "I was furious, thought he'd blown the operation. Went in after him, ready to drag him out. That's when the tripwire caught my boot." William's eyes widened. A trap. Marshall nodded. The whole place was rigged to explode if anyone came through the front door. But Ranger, he swallowed hard. Ranger knocked me down, pinned me to the floor. I couldn't understand what he was doing until I saw the wire. He'd somehow sensed it, knew what it meant. He saved me, and probably half the block. I never knew, William said quietly. The department didn't want it getting out that their K9 had better instincts than their human officers, Marshall explained, and a month later, Ranger was diagnosed with early hip dysplasia and retired. I was told it was policy. He couldn't live with me, but later I found out Thompson had pushed for it, said Ranger had become unpredictable because he disobeyed an order. William looked down at the aging German shepherd, seeing him with new eyes. So, that's why you've been fighting to change the policy all these years. One of the reasons, Marshall admitted. The other is standing right in front of me. For a moment, father and son regarded each other in silence, years of misunderstanding hanging between them. He doesn't have long, Jennifer said gently. The vet gives him 3 months at most. William ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that several people in the room did a double take. My place doesn't allow pets either, he said finally. But Emma's been begging for a dog, and I've got that fenced yard. Marshall stared at his son, hardly daring to hope. Will, are you saying? I'm saying, William interrupted, that my daughter deserves to know her grandfather better. And if that means temporarily housing an old K9 until we figure something out, well. He shrugged, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Consider it a prescription from her doctor. Jennifer beamed, tears spilling down her cheeks. I'll get his medication and special food, she said, and his blanket. He can't sleep without his blanket. As she hurried away, Marshall found himself face to face with his son for the first time in years without anger or recrimination between them. Thank you, he said simply. William nodded. Don't thank me yet. There's a lot to figure out, and I'm not promising anything long-term. I understand. Do you? William's gaze was penetrating. Because there's something else you should know. When Jennifer called me, she didn't just mention Ranger. She said someone had been asking questions about his medical records, that they seemed altered. Marshall frowned. Altered how? She didn't say, but she was worried. Said some things didn't add up about his retirement. William lowered his voice. Dad, what exactly happened 7 years ago? The full story, not the sanitized version. Marshall glanced around the room, suddenly aware of how many ears might be listening. Not here, he murmured. Later. William nodded, then surprised Marshall by extending his hand. For now, let's get this old hero home. He's waited long enough. As they helped Ranger to William's car, Marshall couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted, not just in his relationship with his son, but in the shadows of the past that had haunted him for 7 years. Tommy Davis's warning echoed in his mind. Things aren't what they seem. Looking down at Ranger, now settled comfortably in the back seat of William's SUV, Marshall made a silent promise. Whatever truth lay buried in the past, he would uncover it. For Ranger's sake, and for his own. The first night in William's suburban home was an adjustment for everyone. Ranger, confused by the new surroundings, had paced anxiously until Marshall sat on the floor beside his plaid blanket, gently stroking his fur until the old dog finally settled. Emma, William's 10-year-old daughter, had been beside herself with excitement, asking 100 questions about police dogs until William had firmly sent her to bed. He needs rest, Emma. There'll be time for stories tomorrow. Now, in the quiet, pre-dawn hours, Marshall sat in William's kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and watching Ranger sleep. The German shepherd's chest rose and fell in the uneven rhythm of old age, occasionally interrupted by a soft whine or twitch. Dreams of younger days, perhaps, of suspects tracked and evidence found. "You're up early," William said, padding into the kitchen in sweatpants and a faded Cedar Rapids Marathon t-shirt. Marshall nodded toward Ranger. "Wanted to be here when he woke up." Disorientation can be tough on older dogs. William poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, studying his father. "You haven't changed. You know that? Still hyper-vigilant. Still putting duty first." "Some habits are hard to break," Marshall acknowledged, his eyes never leaving Ranger. "Dad," William began, then paused as if searching for the right words. "What Tommy Davis told you yesterday about Ranger's records being altered, what exactly did he mean?" Marshall sighed, setting down his coffee mug. "I went to Tommy's place last night, after we got Ranger settled. He pulled some strings, got copies of Ranger's department medical files." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew several folded papers. "The official record shows Ranger was diagnosed with severe hip dysplasia at age 9, declared unfit for duty, and retired. But Tommy says that's not what really happened." William frowned, taking the papers. "What do you mean?" "Ranger's regular vet, Dr. Collins, never made that diagnosis. According to Tommy, the department brought in an outside vet who examined Ranger once and declared him unfit. The decision came down from Thompson directly, bypassing the normal review process." "That seems irregular," William admitted, scanning the documents. "But why would Thompson want Ranger retired early?" Marshall's jaw tightened. "That's what I've been asking myself for 7 years." The conversation was interrupted by a soft whine as Ranger stirred, raising his head to look at them. Marshall moved immediately to his side, kneeling despite the protest of his aging knees. "Hey, boy," he said softly. "Remember where you are. You're safe." Ranger's tail thumped weakly against the blanket, his eyes, cloudy but still intelligent, fixed on Marshall's face. "He needs to go out," Marshall explained, helping the old dog to his feet. "His bladder's not what it used to be." William nodded toward the back door. "Fenced yard." "I'll make breakfast while you take care of him." Outside in the cool morning air, Marshall watched as Ranger slowly explored the perimeter of William's modest backyard, stopping to sniff at flower beds and mark territory. Despite his age and illness, there were moments when the old working dog showed through, the way he systematically checked each corner, the alert tilt of his head at a distant sound. "Still on duty, aren't you?" Marshall murmured fondly. When they returned inside, Emma was at the kitchen table, dark hair disheveled, eyes bright with excitement. She froze when Ranger entered, her expression a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "It's okay," Marshall assured her. "He's friendly, just old and a little sore." Emma slipped from her chair and approached cautiously, hand extended as her father had taught her. "Hi, Ranger," she said. "I'm Emma." Ranger sniffed her hand, then pressed his graying muzzle against her palm in a gesture that made Marshall's heart constrict. 7 years ago, Ranger had been trained to keep his distance from civilians unless given specific commands. Now he seemed to recognize a friend instinctively. "He likes me?" Emma exclaimed, her face lighting up. "He's a good judge of character," Marshall said, catching William's eye over her head. After breakfast, William left for his shift at the hospital, leaving Marshall and Emma to settle Ranger for the day. The old dog had already tired from the morning's activities, his breathing more labored, his movements stiffer. "Is he going to die?" Emma asked suddenly, watching as Marshall arranged Ranger's blanket and a patch of sunlight streaming through the living room window. Marshall looked at his granddaughter, surprised by her directness. "Yes," he said honestly, "but not right away. He's very sick, but he's also very strong." Emma nodded solemnly. Dad says that's why he's staying with us. So he can be with his best friend at the end. Your dad said that? Marshall couldn't hide his surprise. Uh-huh. He said you and Ranger were partners, like in the movies, that you saved each other. Marshall settled Ranger on his blanket, the dog sighing contentedly as he found a comfortable position. That's true. We did. Can you tell me a story about when you were partners? Emma asked, sitting cross-legged beside Ranger, her small hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Marshall hesitated, then nodded. I suppose I could. But some of them aren't very happy stories, Emma. That's okay, she said with the simple acceptance of childhood. Dad says not all stories have happy middles, but the best ones have happy endings. Marshall smiled, recognizing Linda's philosophy in his granddaughter's words. Your grandmother used to say something very similar. As Ranger dozed in the sunlight, Marshall shared carefully edited stories of their time together, tracking a lost child through a state park, finding hidden drugs in a school locker, the time Ranger had alerted to a suspect hiding in an attic crawl space. Emma listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed a sharp mind and compassionate heart. By the time William returned home that evening, Marshall had discovered more about his granddaughter in one day than in the previous 5 years of obligatory holiday visits. She's remarkable, Marshall told his son as they sat on the back porch after dinner, watching Emma throw a soft ball for Ranger, who followed it with his eyes but made no attempt to chase it. She gets that from her mother, William said, but there was no bitterness in his tone. The divorce 3 years earlier had been amicable, with William receiving primary custody due to his ex-wife's demanding travel schedule as a corporate attorney. And from you, Marshall countered. She has your perception. Notices everything. William accepted the compliment with a nod, then changed the subject. I spoke with Dr. Collins today. She remembers Ranger's case very well. Marshall straightened. What did she say? That she never recommended retirement. She diagnosed mild hip dysplasia, common in working shepherds his age, and suggested reduced duty, not retirement. She was overruled by administration. Thompson, Marshall said, the name like gravel in his mouth. Yes, but there's more. William lowered his voice, though Emma was too far away to hear. She says around that time, several K9’s were unexpectedly retired or transferred. All dogs who'd been involved in the Rodriguez warehouse operation. Marshall's blood ran cold. All of them? William nodded. 4 dogs total, including Ranger, all with sudden medical issues or behavioral problems, all rehomed to families out of state, except Ranger. Why the exception? She doesn't know. But she thought it was strange that he stayed local, especially given his involvement in the case. Marshall watched as Emma gently scratched behind Ranger's ears, the old dog leaning into her touch with evident pleasure. The Rodriguez case was supposed to be straightforward, drug warehouse, potential weapons, in and out. But something went wrong. The booby trap, William supplied. That, yes, but there was something else. Something Ranger found before we were pulled out. Marshall frowned, the memory frustratingly hazy. After he alerted to the tripwire, we called for backup, waited for the bomb squad. While we were waiting, Ranger kept trying to lead me to a specific corner of the warehouse. I followed him, against protocol I might add, and he started digging at a section of the floor. What was there? Marshall shook his head. I never found out. Thompson arrived with tactical and ordered an immediate evacuation, said the whole place might go up. We were barely out when there was an explosion, smaller than you'd expect for the amount of explosives we later found, almost like a controlled detonation. William absorbed this in silence, his expression thoughtful. And a month later, Ranger was suddenly too disabled to work, and you were assigned a new K9, who I never bonded with, Marshall added, retired 2 years later. It didn't feel right working with another dog. They sat in contemplative silence as twilight deepened around them. Finally, William asked the question that had been hanging between them. "Do you think Thompson was involved in something illegal? That he deliberately separated you and Ranger because of what you found?" Marshall sighed heavily. I don't know, Will. It seems far-fetched. Thompson was always political, always looking for the next promotion, but corrupt. I never saw evidence of that. But you're suspicious now, William pressed. Marshall searched for the right word. I'm concerned about the timing, about the altered records, about Tommy Davis's warning. William nodded slowly. So, what do we do? The question caught Marshall off guard. We? Yes, we. William's gaze was steady. Whatever's going on, it involves my father and a dog who's now under my roof. That makes it my concern, too. Marshall felt a sudden surge of emotion, pride mixed with apprehension. It could be dangerous, Will, if Thompson is hiding something. Dad, William interrupted. I'm not a child anymore. I make life-or-death decisions every day in the ER. I can handle a little investigation. Before Marshall could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming text. He frowned at the unfamiliar number, then at the message itself. Need to talk. Old training ground. 9 p.m. Come alone. No phone. What is it? William asked, noting his father's expression. Marshall hesitated, then handed him the phone. Could be nothing. Could be a trap. William read the message, his frown deepening. You're not going. I have to. Dad, this is exactly the kind of reckless— It's from Jennifer Simmons, Marshall interrupted. That's her new number. She texted earlier to check on Ranger. William looked skeptical. Why the cloak and dagger routine? I don't know, but I trust her. Then I'm coming with you. Marshall shook his head firmly. No. Emma needs one of us here. And Ranger— He glanced at the old dog, now dozing with his head in Emma's lap. He gets anxious when both of us are gone. Their argument was interrupted by Emma calling from the yard. Grandpa, Dad. Look what Ranger's doing. They turned to see Ranger on his feet, head raised, ears pricked forward in the alert posture of his working days. His attention was fixed on the fence line where William's property backed up to a wooded area. Something's got his attention, Marshall said, moving toward them. Probably just a squirrel or raccoon. But Ranger's behavior said otherwise. The old dog moved stiffly toward the fence, his posture tense, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Emma, come here, William called, suddenly alert to potential danger. The girl obeyed immediately, recognizing the authority in her father's voice. As she reached the porch, Marshall was already at the fence, peering into the gathering darkness. See anything? William asked. Marshall shook his head. No, but— He broke off as a twig snapped in the underbrush beyond the fence. Someone's there. Ranger's growl intensified, his arthritic legs braced as if ready to give chase despite his condition. Hello? Marshall called. Who's there? Silence answered him, then the distinct sound of retreating footsteps crashing through undergrowth. They're running, Marshall said grimly. Emma, go inside. We'll stay with her and Ranger. Dad, wait. But Marshall was already scaling the fence with a dexterity that belied his age, dropping to the other side and disappearing into the trees. The woods were dark, visibility limited to a few feet ahead. Marshall moved cautiously, tracking the sounds of someone moving rapidly away. His police training took over. Assess, pursue, contain. The figure ahead was large, male, judging by the heavy footfalls, moving confidently despite the darkness. Police, Marshall called, the old authority flooding back into his voice. Stop! The footsteps accelerated, then suddenly ceased. Marshall froze, listening intently. The woods had gone silent, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the pounding of his own heart in his ears. The attack came from his right, a dark figure lunging from behind a tree. Marshall pivoted, barely avoiding a blow aimed at his head. Years of training kicked in as he dropped into a defensive stance, blocking a second strike and countering with a sharp jab to his attacker's midsection. The man grunted but didn't fall, instead grabbing Marshall's jacket and using his momentum to slam him against a tree trunk. Pain exploded along Marshall's spine as he struggled to break free. "You should have stayed away, old man," a voice growled in his ear. "Some secrets need to stay buried." Marshall drove his knee upward, catching his attacker in the groin. The man's grip loosened enough for Marshall to break free, but as he turned to confront him, something hard connected with the side of his head. Stars burst across his vision as he fell to his knees. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard his attacker retreating, leaves crunching underfoot. Marshall tried to rise, to pursue, but the world tilted sickeningly around him. "Dad!" William's voice penetrated the fog. Moments later, his son was kneeling beside him, a flashlight beam playing over his face. "I'm okay," Marshall managed, though the throbbing in his head suggested otherwise. "Did you see him?" William shook his head. "Just heard the commotion. Emma's inside with Ranger." He helped Marshall to his feet, steadying him when he swayed. "What happened?" "Someone was watching the house," Marshall said, wincing as William's fingers probed the growing lump on his temple. "Ranger alerted. When I came after him, he attacked." "Did you recognize him?" "No, too dark." Marshall leaned heavily on his son as they made their way back toward the fence. "But he knew me, called me old man, said some secrets need to stay buried." William's expression hardened. "That settles it. You're not meeting Jennifer alone tonight." Marshall wanted to argue, but found he lacked the energy. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind pain and a creeping exhaustion. "Fine," he conceded, "but we need someone to stay with Emma." "I'll call Dr. Collins," William decided. "She owes me a favor, and she knows Ranger. She can stay at the house while we're gone." Back inside, Emma's eyes widened at the sight of her grandfather's injury. "You're hurt." "Just a bump," Marshall assured her, allowing William to guide him to a chair. "Your dad's going to fix me right up." While William retrieved his medical bag, Marshall noticed Ranger watching him intently from his blanket, concern evident in his cloudy eyes. "It's okay, boy," Marshall told him. "Not the first time I've had my bell rung. Won't be the last." Ranger whined softly, struggling to his feet and making his way painfully across the room to Marshall's side. The old dog pressed against his leg, a gesture so familiar it brought a lump to Marshall's throat. "Still looking out for me, huh?" he murmured, scratching behind Ranger's ears. As William cleaned the cut on his temple, Marshall's mind raced. The attack confirmed his suspicions. There was something about the Rodriguez case, something he and Ranger had discovered that someone wanted to remain hidden, something worth assaulting a retired police officer over 7 years later. But what? The old training ground was deserted when they arrived at 8:55 p.m., the abandoned K9 facility, a collection of shadowy buildings against the night sky. Marshall insisted on driving despite his injury, with William reluctantly agreeing after determining he didn't have a concussion. "This place gives me the creeps," William commented, as they parked near the main building. "Why would Jennifer want to meet here?" "Privacy," Marshall suggested, scanning the area for signs of movement. "This facility was decommissioned 4 years ago when they built the new training center. Almost no one comes out here anymore." They exited the car, Marshall instructing William to stay slightly behind him, an old habit from his police days that his son accepted with only mild eye-rolling. "There," William whispered, pointing toward a small utility shed near the obstacle course. A faint light flickered from within. Marshall approached cautiously, hand instinctively reaching for a service weapon that hadn't been there for 5 years. "Jennifer?" he called softly. The shed door creaked open, and Jennifer Simmons emerged, her face pale in the beam of the flashlight she carried. "Marshall, you came." Her eyes widened at the sight of William. "I said come alone." "Someone attacked my father an hour ago," William said flatly. "He's not going anywhere alone right now." Jennifer's expression shifted from surprise to alarm. "Attacked? Where?" "At my house," Marshall explained. "Someone was watching us. Ranger alerted." Jennifer seemed to collapse in on herself, shoulders slumping. "It's happening again. I was afraid of this." She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "We can't talk here. Follow me." She led them to a small office inside the main building, using a key Marshall didn't know she possessed to unlock the door. Inside, the room was dusty but undisturbed. Filing cabinets lining one wall, a desk and chairs still in place as if the occupants had simply stepped out for lunch and never returned. "How do you have a key?" Marshall asked as Jennifer closed the door behind them. "Carl," she answered simply. "My husband. He wasn't just a retired accountant like I told you." She took a deep breath. "He was FBI. Undercover." Marshall and William exchanged startled glances. "FBI?" Marshall repeated. "Investigating what?" Jennifer sat heavily in one of the chairs, suddenly looking every one of her 60-plus years. "Corruption. Drug trafficking. Evidence tampering. A whole web of it centered right here in Cedar Rapids." Her eyes met Marshall's. The Rodriguez case was the linchpin. Carl was close, so close, to bringing the whole operation down. And then Ranger and I nearly walked into a death trap," Marshall finished. Jennifer nodded. "The explosion wasn't an accident, Marshall. It wasn't even meant to kill you. It was targeted, designed to destroy specific evidence before it could be found." "Evidence of what?" "Money laundering. The Rodriguez cartel wasn't just using that warehouse for drugs. They were moving millions through a network of local businesses. Dirty cops were on the payroll, helping launder the money, providing protection." Marshall felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. "Thompson?" Jennifer's expression confirmed his suspicion. "Among others. Carl had been building the case for years. When you and Ranger nearly discovered their operation, they panicked. The explosion destroyed the financial records, but they couldn't risk Ranger finding something else. So they forced his retirement," William said, the pieces falling into place. "Separated him from Dad." "Yes, but they made a mistake," Jennifer continued. "They should have sent Ranger far away, like the other K9’s who'd been at the scene. But Thompson thought it would look suspicious if all the dogs suddenly disappeared. So he arranged for us to adopt Ranger, thinking a civilian home would be the end of it." "Except your husband was FBI," Marshall said, understanding dawning. "Was that coincidence?" Jennifer shook her head. "Carl volunteered when he learned the department was looking for a home for Ranger. He suspected the dog might remember something important." "Remember what?" William asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "He's a dog, not a witness." "A dog with specialized training," Marshall corrected. K9s like Ranger are taught to alert to specific scents, specific situations. If he found something in that warehouse, something the corrupt officers didn't want found, he might recognize it again under the right circumstances. "Exactly," Jennifer confirmed. "Carl spent years testing Ranger, showing him photos, taking him to locations connected to the case. 3 years ago, Ranger finally reacted to something. A storage unit on the edge of town. Carl found financial records inside, copies that hadn't been destroyed in the explosion." "Where are these records now?" Marshall demanded. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "Carl hid them. He didn't trust anyone, not even his FBI handlers. There'd been leaks before." She twisted her wedding ring anxiously. "He was going to move them to a secure location, but then Then what? William prompted gently. He died. Jennifer's voice broke. Car accident. Brake lines cut. The official investigation called it inconclusive, but I knew. Now they'd found out what he was doing. Marshall reached across the desk, covering her trembling hands with his own. I'm so sorry, Jennifer. She nodded, collecting herself. After that, I was watched constantly. I couldn't access the evidence without leading them right to it. So I waited, kept Ranger safe, hoped eventually I could find someone to trust. Her gaze locked with Marshall's. When I heard you were still fighting to change the K9 retirement policy after all these years, I thought maybe you called me back to help find the evidence, Marshall concluded. Yes, but now they know you're involved. The attack today proves it. William, who had been quiet, processing the revelations, suddenly straightened. If what you're saying is true, Ranger is the key. He can lead us to this evidence. Jennifer nodded. That's what Carl believed. But Ranger's sick now, confused sometimes. And without Carl's notes, I don't know exactly what triggers his recognition. Marshall thought of the old German shepherd, loyally serving even in retirement, potentially holding the key to exposing corruption that had cost lives. We'll find it, he said with quiet determination. Whatever Ranger knows, whatever he found, we'll figure it out. Jennifer's relief was palpable. I was hoping you'd say that. But Marshall, you need to understand something. Her expression grew grave. These people have killed to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to do it again. Marshall exchanged a long look with his son, seeing in William's eyes the same mixture of apprehension and resolve he felt himself. Some things are worth the risk, Marshall said finally. Justice is one of them. As they prepared to leave, Jennifer handed Marshall a small thumb drive. Everything Carl managed to document is on here. Names, dates, suspicious transfers. It's not enough for prosecution, but it might help you understand what you're looking for. Marshall pocketed the drive, a new sense of purpose flooding through him. For 7 years, he'd believed Ranger's retirement was simply unfortunate timing, a bureaucratic decision that had separated him from his partner. Now he understood it was something far more sinister, and that Ranger, even in his final days, might help bring justice to those responsible. We'll be in touch, he promised Jennifer. Stay safe. As they drove back toward William's house, Marshall's mind raced with possibilities. If Thompson and others in the department were corrupt, who could they trust? How could they safely investigate without raising alarms? And most importantly, what had Ranger found in that warehouse 7 years ago that was worth killing for? The old German shepherd might be their only hope of answering these questions, but with cancer spreading through his body, time was running out. They needed to unlock Ranger's memories, and soon, before death silenced him forever. Dr. Sarah Collins sat at William's kitchen table, her stethoscope hanging around her neck, expression grave as she finished examining Ranger. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor where the German shepherd lay panting slightly, exhausted from the simple exertion of standing for the examination. The mass has grown, she said quietly, meeting Marshall's concerned gaze. And there's fluid building up in his lungs. The medications are helping with the pain, but they can't stop the progression. Marshall knelt beside Ranger, gently stroking the gray muzzle. How long? Dr. Collins sighed, removing her stethoscope and tucking it into her bag. It's hard to say, given the rapid growth over the past week. Perhaps less time than we originally thought. 2 months, maybe less. William, leaning against the kitchen counter with arms crossed, asked the question Marshall couldn't bring himself to voice. Is he suffering? Not significantly, not yet, Dr. Collins assured them. He's uncomfortable at times, but the pain management protocol is working. When that changes, and it will, we'll need to make some hard decisions. Marshall nodded, his throat tight. 7 years apart, and now their reunion would be measured in weeks. It seemed cruelly unfair, yet he couldn't help feeling grateful for whatever time they had left. "There's something else we need to discuss," Marshall said, glancing at William for confirmation. They had agreed that morning to bring Dr. Collins into their confidence. As Ranger's veterinarian and an advocate for K9 officers, she might be their best ally. For the next hour, they explained everything. Jennifer's revelations about her husband's FBI work, the corruption within the department, Ranger's potential knowledge of hidden evidence, and the attack in William's backyard. Dr. Collins listened without interruption, her expression shifting from skepticism to concern to outrage. "I always thought there was something off about Ranger's retirement," she admitted when they finished. "The outside vet they brought in, the rush to declare him unfit, it never sat right with me. But corruption at this level?" She shook her head in disbelief. "It's hard to imagine." "Jennifer provided some proof," William said, opening his laptop to show her the files from Carl Simmons's thumb drive. Bank transfers, shell companies, evidence of money laundering through local businesses, all connected to the Rodriguez cartel. Dr. Collins studied the screen, her frown deepening. "This is substantial. But you said the key evidence is still hidden somewhere, and only Ranger knows where?" "That's our theory," Marshall confirmed. "Carl Simmons spent years trying to trigger Ranger's memory of whatever he found in that warehouse. Eventually he succeeded, and Ranger led him to a storage unit with financial records. But after Carl died, Jennifer couldn't risk retrieving the evidence herself." "So what's your plan?" Dr. Collins asked. "Ranger's in no condition for extensive field work." Marshall exchanged a glance with his son. "We're not sure yet. We need to figure out what would trigger his recognition. What specific scent or sight or sound connected to the evidence? And we need to do it before Thompson realizes what we're up to," William added grimly. "The attack yesterday was just a warning. Next time could be worse." Dr. Collins was silent for a moment, absently stroking Ranger's head as she considered. "I might be able to help," she said finally. "There's new research on memory in working dogs, how they process and retain information, particularly scent markers. I have a colleague at the university who specializes in this field." "Can we trust them?" Marshall asked immediately. "Dr. Patel has no connection to local law enforcement," she assured him, "and she's been an advocate for retired service animals for years. If anyone can help us understand how to unlock what Ranger remembers, it's her." Marshall looked down at Ranger, who had dozed off, his breathing labored even in sleep. "Time isn't on our side," he said quietly. "Whatever we do, we need to do it quickly." The next morning found Marshall, William, and Ranger in Dr. Patel's modest office at the university's Veterinary Sciences building. The neurologist, a petite woman with keen eyes and a gentle manner, had cleared her schedule after receiving Dr. Collins' urgent call. "Fascinating case," she murmured, reviewing Ranger's medical history. "And you believe he's retained specific memory of evidence from 7 years ago?" "We know he recognized something 3 years ago," Marshall explained. "Something that led to hidden financial records. We need to trigger that recognition again." "Dr." Patel nodded thoughtfully. "Dogs don't remember the way humans do. They don't have episodic memory in the same sense. But their associative memory, particularly regarding scents, can be extraordinarily detailed and long-lasting." "So, how do we access that memory?" William asked. "Context is key," Dr. Patel explained. "The original environment, similar stimuli." She studied Ranger, who was resting comfortably on a blanket they'd brought. "In a younger, healthier dog, I'd suggest returning to the original location, but given his condition, that's not possible," Marshall agreed. "The warehouse was demolished years ago anyway." Dr. Patel considered this. What about objects from the case? Evidence that was collected? Photographs of the scene? Marshall shook his head. Most of it was destroyed in the explosion. What wasn't would be in evidence storage at the department, which we can't access without alerting Thompson. There might be another way, William suggested. What about people associated with the case? Would Ranger recognize someone connected to the evidence? Dr. Patel brightened. That's actually quite promising. Dogs form strong associations between people and events. If there were individuals present when Ranger discovered whatever he found, he might well react to seeing them again. Marshall thought back to that day, trying to recall who had been present. Thompson was there, but approaching him directly is too risky. There were patrol officers, tactical team members. He paused, a memory surfacing. Rodriguez himself was brought in later that day. He posted bail within hours, which seemed unusual for the charges, and disappeared. The case against him eventually fell apart due to contaminated evidence. "Where is Rodriguez now?" William asked. "Last I heard, he'd gone legitimate. Owns a chain of car washes, a couple of restaurants." Respectable businessman. Marshall's tone made clear his skepticism about this transformation. "That's our starting point then," William decided. If Rodriguez was laundering money through local businesses, and those records are what Ranger found, seeing Rodriguez might trigger his memory. Dr. Patel nodded in agreement. "It's certainly worth trying, but please understand, Ranger's age and illness complicate things. His cognitive function may be affected. The memory might be there, but his ability to communicate it could be impaired." Marshall placed a protective hand on Ranger's shoulder. "We'll be careful with him. No unnecessary stress." "Of course," Dr. Patel said gently. "And I'd like to help however I can. This is an extraordinary case, not just the criminal aspects but the bond between you and Ranger. That connection might be our strongest asset in recovering his memory." They left the university with a cautious plan: locate Rodriguez, orchestrate a casual encounter where Ranger could see him, and watch for any reaction that might indicate recognition. It was far from foolproof, but it was a start. Finding Rodriguez proved easier than expected. A quick internet search revealed he owned Platinum Touch Car Wash, with 3 locations around Cedar Rapids. The flagship location, according to its website, featured personal supervision from the owner himself every Tuesday. "Tomorrow's Tuesday," William noted as they drove home. "We could take my car in for a wash, bring Ranger along." Marshall nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead to potential complications. "We need to be careful. If Rodriguez is still connected to Thompson and the others, he might recognize me, or Ranger. It's been 7 years, Dad. You're retired. Ranger's an old dog now." "Even if he sees you, would he really connect you to a raid from that long ago?" "Maybe not," Marshall conceded. "But we should take precautions. I'll stay in the car with Ranger. You handle the transaction." William agreed, and they spent the rest of the drive discussing contingencies: what to do if Ranger reacted strongly, how to extract themselves quickly if needed, where to go if they were followed. Back at William's house, they found Emma playing a board game with Jennifer Simmons at the kitchen table. The two had formed an immediate bond when Jennifer arrived to help watch Emma during school vacation days. "Ranger's been good," Jennifer reported as they entered. "Ate a little lunch, took his medication, no problems." "Thank you for staying with him," Marshall said, kneeling to greet the German shepherd, who had struggled to his feet at their arrival. "It's the least I can do," Jennifer replied. "Did your meeting with Dr. Patel help?" William briefly explained their plan to visit Rodriguez's car wash the next day. Jennifer listened intently, her expression troubled. "Be careful," she warned. Carl believed Rodriguez was just a front man, the public face of the operation. The real power was behind the scenes. "Thompson?" Marshall said grimly. Jennifer nodded. "And others. Carl never learned all the names before." She trailed off, glancing at Emma. before he died," William finished quietly. "We understand the risks, Jennifer, but this may be our best chance to trigger Ranger's memory." That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Marshall sat with Ranger on the back porch, watching fireflies rise from the darkening yard. The old dog leaned heavily against his leg, occasionally looking up at him with cloudy eyes that still somehow managed to convey complete trust. "Big day tomorrow, partner," Marshall murmured, scratching behind Ranger's ears just the way he had always liked. "Think you're up for one last mission?" Ranger's tail thumped weakly against the porch boards, not the enthusiastic wag of his younger days, but a clear affirmative nonetheless. Marshall smiled, his throat tight with emotion. "That's what I thought. One more time, for old time's sake." The Platinum Touch car wash was busy when they arrived the next morning, a line of vehicles waiting for the premium hand-washing service that had made Rodriguez's business so successful. Marshall, wearing a baseball cap pulled low and sunglasses despite the overcast day, sat in the passenger seat with Ranger beside him in the back, a blanket draped over his distinctive form. "Remember the plan," Marshall reminded his son as they joined the queue. "Quick observation only. If Ranger reacts, we note it and leave. No confrontation." William nodded, hands tense on the steering wheel. "And if we're made? We're just a father and son getting a car wash with our old dog along for the ride." Nothing suspicious about that. As they inched closer to the entrance, Marshall studied the operation through his window. The business appeared legitimate enough. A modern facility with uniformed staff, computerized systems, the kind of place that might indeed process thousands of dollars daily. Perfect for laundering money. "There," William murmured, nodding toward a man standing near the entrance, greeting customers. "That's him." Marshall peered at Rodriguez, a stocky man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing of someone used to authority. He wore expensive, casual clothes and a Rolex watch that caught the light as he gestured to his staff. "Prosperous businessman," Marshall observed dryly. "Amazing what a career change can do." As their turn approached, Marshall removed the blanket from Ranger, helping the old dog sit up so he could see through the window. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "Just look around." "Tell us what you see." Ranger's ears pricked forward, his posture alert despite his illness. As Rodriguez approached their vehicle, clipboard in hand to take their order, the German shepherd's attention fixed on him with an intensity Marshall hadn't seen in years. "Good morning," Rodriguez greeted William, who had lowered his window. "What service can we—" He broke off abruptly, his gaze moving past William to Marshall in the passenger seat, then to Ranger in the back. For a moment his professional smile faltered, a flicker of recognition, or was it fear, crossing his features. In the back seat, Ranger had gone rigid, a low growl building in his chest. The sound transported Marshall instantly back to their working days. It was Ranger's alert signal, the warning he gave when he detected narcotics or when a suspect was nearby. "Just the basic wash," William was saying smoothly, pretending not to notice Rodriguez's reaction. "Beautiful place you've got here." Rodriguez seemed to recover his composure, though his smile now seemed forced. "Thank you." "New customer?" "Just passing through town," William replied. "My father's visiting from Des Moines." Rodriguez's eyes flickered to Marshall again, lingering a moment too long on his face. "Welcome to Cedar Rapids. First visit?" "I used to live here," Marshall said, keeping his tone casual despite the tension coiling in his gut. "Long time ago." Ranger's growl deepened, drawing Rodriguez's attention. The businessman's face paled slightly as he took a step back from the vehicle. "Your dog seems unsettled," he observed, voice carefully neutral. "He's old," William explained. "Gets anxious in new places. Nothing to worry about." Rodriguez nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Ranger, who was now straining forward against his harness, teeth bared in a snarl that belied his age and illness. "Pull ahead to the preparation area," Rodriguez instructed, gesturing to an attendant. "My staff will take care of you." As they pulled forward, Marshall placed a calming hand on Ranger's neck. "Easy, boy. We got what we came for." And they had. Ranger's reaction had been unmistakable. Recognition, alert, warning. Whatever the dog had found in that warehouse 7 years ago, Rodriguez was connected to it. "He made us," William said quietly as an attendant directed them to the washing area. "He recognized you. And Ranger." Marshall nodded grimly. "We need to get out of here. Now." But before William could put the car in reverse, a large SUV pulled in behind them, blocking their exit. 2 men in platinum touch uniforms emerged, moving with the purposeful stride of security personnel rather than car wash attendants. "Dad?" William warned, eyes on the rear-view mirror. "I see them," Marshall replied, mind racing through options. "Stay calm. Follow my lead." As one of the men approached William's window, Marshall reached into his pocket, fingers closing around his phone. Without looking, he pressed the emergency SOS button Dr. Collins had helped him program, a silent alert that would send their location to Jennifer Simmons and Tommy Davis. "Mr. Rodriguez asked me to personally escort you through our premium service," the man said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "If you'll just exit the vehicle, we can get started." William glanced at his father, who gave an imperceptible shake of his head. "Actually, we're running late for an appointment," William replied. "Maybe another time." The man's smile vanished. "I'm afraid Mr. Rodriguez insists. Please step out of the car, sir." In the back seat, Ranger's growl had become a continuous rumble, his body tense despite his weakness. The sound sent a chill down Marshall's spine. It was the same warning Ranger had given in the Rodriguez warehouse moments before discovering the tripwire. "We're leaving," Marshall said firmly. "Please move your vehicle." The second man had circled to the passenger side, hand reaching ominously beneath his uniform jacket. "That's not how this works, Officer Reynolds." The use of his title, not used in 7 years, confirmed Marshall's fears. They hadn't just been recognized, they'd been expected. "Last chance," the first man said. "Step out of the car or we'll assist you." William's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Dad, what do we—" The rest of his question was drowned out by Ranger's sudden, explosive barking as the German Shepherd lunged forward between the front seats, teeth snapping at the man reaching through William's window. The distraction was all they needed. William slammed the car into reverse, the sudden movement catching the men off guard. The bumper collided with the SUV behind them with a sickening crunch of metal, but William kept accelerating, forcing the larger vehicle backward several feet before its driver could react. "Go, go, go!" Marshall shouted as a gap opened up. William spun the wheel, tires squealing as they swerved around the SUV and toward the exit. In the rearview mirror, Marshall saw Rodriguez emerge from the office building, phone to his ear, face contorted with anger. "They're calling it in," Marshall warned as they skidded onto the main road. "We've got minutes at most before Thompson knows we were there." William nodded grimly, pushing the car well above the speed limit as they wove through traffic. "Where to?" Marshall thought quickly. "Not your house. They know where you live now." He pulled out his phone, relieved to see a text from Jennifer acknowledging his SOS. "Head for the old K9 training facility. Jennifer will meet us there." As they drove, Marshall turned to check on Ranger. The burst of energy had cost the old dog dearly. He lay panting on the back seat, each breath a labored wheeze that tore at Marshall's heart. "That was some move back there, partner," he said softly, reaching back to stroke Ranger's head. "Just like old times." Ranger's tail thumped weakly in response, but his eyes remained alert, watchful. Whatever he had recognized at the car wash had awakened something in him, a sense of purpose. of duty not yet complete. He reacted strongly to Rodriguez, William observed, checking the mirrors for signs of pursuit. That confirms our theory, right? Rodriguez is connected to whatever Ranger found. Marshall nodded, mind racing. Yes, but there's something more. Ranger didn't just recognize Rodriguez. He gave a specific alert, the same one he used for narcotics. You think the evidence involves drugs? Maybe, Marshall said, thinking aloud. Or maybe it's the scent he associates with the evidence. If the financial records were stored with drug shipments or in containers that had held drugs, William considered this as he navigated toward the outskirts of town. So Rodriguez is our connection. What next? We can't exactly kidnap him and make him lead us to the evidence. No, Marshall agreed. But maybe we don't need to. Ranger recognized him after 7 years. If we can figure out what specifically triggered that recognition, we might be able to track the evidence ourselves. They arrived at the old training facility to find Jennifer already waiting, her expression tight with worry. Tommy Davis's truck pulled in moments later, the retired officer emerging with a shotgun that he made no attempt to conceal. You stirred up the hornet's nest this time, Marsh. Davis greeted them grimly. Got a friend in dispatch. Calls going out to all units. Bolo for your son's vehicle, described as fleeing the scene of an altercation. Thompson? Marshall asked. Davis nodded. Took the call personally. Whatever you did, you got his attention. Inside the abandoned building, they gathered in the same office where Jennifer had first revealed her husband's FBI work. While Davis kept watch at the window, Marshall explained Ranger's reaction to Rodriguez in their narrow escape. Carl would be ecstatic, Jennifer said, kneeling beside Ranger's blanket where the exhausted dog rested. This confirms everything he suspected, that Rodriguez is still connected to the operation, that Ranger remembers what he found. But it doesn't get us to the evidence, Marshall pointed out. And now they know we're looking. Maybe that's not entirely bad, William suggested, earning surprised looks from the others. Think about it. They're rattled. People make mistakes when they're rattled. What are you suggesting? Jennifer asked. I'm suggesting we push harder, force their hand. Marshall studied his son, seeing a determination that mirrored his own. That's dangerous, Will. These people have already killed to protect their secret. I know, William acknowledged. But we have something they don't. Ranger. He's the key to all of this. If we can figure out exactly what he remembers. Tommy Davis rejoined the conversation, shotgun still cradled in his arms. The Rodriguez warehouse was demolished years ago. But I might know someone who has photos from before the explosion. Crime scene techs document everything. Can we trust them? Marshall asked skeptically. She retired last year, kept copies of everything, against protocol, but she always said evidence had a way of disappearing in certain cases. Davis met Marshall's gaze steadily. Worth a shot, isn't it? Marshall looked down at Ranger, who despite his exhaustion remained alert, eyes fixed on his former partner as if awaiting the next command. 7 years separated, months of life remaining, and still the old dog was ready to serve. Yes, Marshall decided. It's worth a shot. While Davis made the call to his contact, William pulled Marshall aside. Dad, we need to talk about Emma. If these people know who I am, where I live. You're right, Marshall agreed immediately. She's not safe. Neither is Ranger, for that matter. I can send her to her mother's in Chicago, William said. But Ranger can't travel that far in his condition. Marshall nodded, a plan forming. I have an idea about that. Let me make a call. An hour later, Dr. Collins arrived, her SUV packed with veterinary supplies. After examining Ranger and administering pain medication, she confirmed what they already feared. The excitement had taken a toll on his already weakened system. The cancer is advancing rapidly, she told them privately, while Jennifer sat with the sleeping dog. The fluid in his lungs is increasing. He's fighting hard, but How long? Marshall asked, the familiar question now carrying even more weight. Dr. Collins shook her head. Days, maybe. A week at most, unless we hospitalize him for more aggressive treatment. That's not an option now, William said. He needs to stay with us. I understand. Dr. Collins hesitated, then added, There's something else you should know. I received a call from Chief Thompson this morning asking about Ranger's medical records from 7 years ago. He claimed it was for an audit, but he's tying up loose ends, Marshall concluded grimly, making sure there's no paper trail. I told him the records were archived and would take time to retrieve, Dr. Collins assured them. But he'll keep pushing. By evening, their plans were set. Emma would leave for Chicago the next morning, accompanied by Jennifer, who would stay with William's ex-wife until it was safe to return. Ranger would remain with Marshall and William, who would meet Davis's contact, a retired crime scene technician named Gloria Winters, to review photos from the Rodriguez warehouse. As darkness fell, Marshall sat beside Ranger on the floor of the abandoned office, the old dog's head resting in his lap. Despite the dangers surrounding them, despite the uncertainty ahead, there was a strange peace in this moment. Two old partners reunited, facing one final mission together. We're close, boy, Marshall murmured, stroking the graying fur. Whatever you found, whatever you remember, we're going to finish this. Together. Ranger's eyes opened briefly, meeting Marshall's gaze with a clarity that defied his age and illness. In that moment, Marshall felt the same connection that had guided them through countless operations, the wordless understanding that had made them one of the department's most successful K9 teams. Tomorrow they would pursue the evidence that might bring down Thompson and his corrupt network. Tomorrow they would risk everything for justice, long delayed. But tonight, in this quiet moment, there was only Marshall and Ranger, and the bond that 7 years of separation had failed to break. The morning dawned gray and humid, a steady drizzle tapping against the windows of the safe house Tommy Davis had arranged, a small hunting cabin belonging to his brother-in-law, tucked away in the woods 20 miles outside Cedar Rapids. Marshall stood at the window, watching Emma help Jennifer load the last of their overnight bags into Jennifer's sedan. His granddaughter's face was solemn, the gravity of the situation not lost on her despite their attempts to shield her from the worst of it. She'll be safe in Chicago, William said, joining Marshall at the window. Elaine may be my ex-wife, but she's a good mother, and her condo building has security. Marshall nodded, throat tight as he watched Emma kneel to say goodbye to Ranger. The German shepherd lay on his blanket on the cabin's covered porch, too weak to stand, but still managing to lift his head for a gentle lick to Emma's cheek. She's got your resilience, Marshall observed. Doesn't complain, just adapts, William smiled faintly. Gets that from her grandmother. Mom always did know how to roll with the punches. The mention of Linda brought a familiar ache to Marshall's chest. How she would have handled this situation, with the practical determination that had seen them through 3 decades of marriage and the various crises of his police career. Emma bounded up the porch steps for a final round of goodbyes, throwing her arms around her father's waist. Promise you'll be careful, Daddy? William hugged her tightly. Promise. It's just some boring police business with Grandpa. We'll be done before you know it. Emma turned to Marshall, her young face serious. Take care of Ranger, okay? And Daddy, too. Marshall knelt to her level, ignoring the protest from his aging knees. That's a promise, sweetheart. And when this is all over, we'll have that camping trip we talked about. After one last hug, Emma rejoined Jennifer in the car. Marshall watched them drive away, the sedan disappearing down the gravel road that wound through the trees. A heaviness settled in his chest, part worry for Emma's safety, part acknowledgement of what lay ahead. Gloria will be here in an hour, Tommy Davis announced, emerging from the cabin's small kitchen with coffee mugs. bringing everything she's got on the Rodriguez warehouse. Marshall accepted the coffee gratefully. Any movement from Thompson? Davis shook his head. Not officially, but my contact at dispatch says patrol cars have been circling your old neighborhood, Will's place too. They're looking for you. What about Rodriguez? William asked. Business as usual at the car wash, Davis replied. But security's been beefed up. Whatever you stirred up yesterday, they're taking it seriously. Marshall's gaze drifted to Ranger, who had dragged himself back inside and now lay at Marshall's feet, his breathing labored but steady. The medication doctor Collins had provided was helping manage the pain, but there was no hiding the rapid decline in his condition. The burst of energy at the car wash had cost him dearly. "We're running out of time," Marshall said quietly, not specifying whether he meant for the investigation or for Ranger. Perhaps both. Gloria Winters arrived precisely on time, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with short silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She carried a weathered leather briefcase which she placed on the cabin's small dining table with reverence. "Tommy says you're chasing ghosts," she greeted Marshall without preamble. "The Rodriguez case. Thought that was dead and buried years ago." "Not dead," Marshall replied. "Just buried. We're trying to dig it up again." Gloria's eyes flickered to Ranger, recognition dawning. "Is that—" "I remember him from the scene. German Shepherd, K9 unit. Found the tripwire." Marshall nodded. "My partner—" "Ranger." Something softened in Gloria's expression. "Good dog. Saved a lot of lives that day." She patted her briefcase. "Well, let's see if we can help him finish what he started." The next hour was spent poring over crime scene photographs and sketches Gloria had preserved, against department regulations, from the Rodriguez warehouse raid. Spread across the table were images of the exterior, the main storage area, the office where drugs had been found, and the corner where Ranger had alerted to something beneath the floorboards. "This is right before the evacuation order," Gloria explained, pointing to a photograph showing Ranger pawing intently at a section of flooring. "You can see where he'd started to expose something under the boards." Marshall studied the image intently. "I remember this. Thompson arrived right after, ordered everyone out, said the bomb squad had found additional explosives." Gloria's mouth tightened. That was the official story. "But I was with the bomb squad that day. We found the tripwire, sure, but no secondary devices. Thompson's evacuation order came from him alone, not from the bomb techs." Davis and William exchanged glances. "So he was covering something up," William concluded. "That was always my suspicion," Gloria confirmed, "especially when parts of the warehouse burned despite the fire department being right outside. Very convenient fire. Destroyed exactly that corner." She tapped the photograph. "Whatever your dog found, Thompson made damn sure no one else would find it." Marshall leaned closer to the image, focusing on the exposed section of flooring. "Can you enhance this part here?" Gloria pulled out a magnifying glass, positioning it over the area. "Best I can do. Digital copies were corrupted in the system. These prints are all that remain." Through the magnifying glass, Marshall could just make out what appeared to be a metal box or container partially visible beneath the splintered floorboards. "There," he said. "That's what Ranger found." William peered over his shoulder. "A safe? Lockbox of some kind?" "Something like that," Marshall agreed. "Gloria, are there any other angles of this area? Anything showing more detail?" She shuffled through the photographs, eventually producing one taken from a different position. "This is from the evidence processing team before Thompson's evacuation order. Not great quality, but—" In this image, Ranger was still alerting, but had moved slightly, revealing more of what lay beneath the floor. It wasn't a safe or lockbox as they'd first thought, but something else entirely. "That's a P.O. box key," Davis said suddenly, pointing to a small object visible among what appeared to be papers. "Standard USPS." Marshall felt a surge of excitement. "Oh, that's it. Financial records and a key to more evidence," That's what Thompson was so desperate to hide. And what Carl Simmons eventually found, William added. The storage unit Jennifer mentioned. It must have contained copies of those records and the key. Marshall turned to Gloria. Is there anything in these photos that shows a number on the key? Any identifying marks? Gloria shook her head regretfully. Not that I can see. But... She hesitated, then continued. There is one other thing. When we were processing evidence from Rodriguez's office, I found a receipt from Cedar Rapids main post office, box rental. I logged it, but it disappeared from the evidence inventory the next day. Thompson again, Davis muttered. Most likely, Gloria agreed. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another procedural error in a case that had plenty. But now it might be exactly what we're looking for, Marshall finished. He looked down at Ranger, who had been watching the proceedings with alert interest despite his weakened state. What do you think, boy? Is that what you found? A post office box key? Ranger's ears perked up at Marshall's tone, but otherwise showed no reaction to the question. Whatever recognition he'd displayed at the car wash wasn't being triggered by the photographs alone. We need to take him to the post office, William suggested. See if being there sparks the same reaction he had with Rodriguez. Davis frowned. That's risky. Thompson's got people looking for you all over town. We don't have a choice, Marshall said firmly. We're racing against time here. He didn't need to elaborate. Everyone in the room could see Ranger's deteriorating condition. They formulated a plan. Davis would drive Marshall and Ranger to the main post office in his truck, which wasn't being looked for. William would follow separately in Gloria's car as backup. They would arrive just before closing time, when the lobby would be less crowded but still accessible. What exactly are we hoping to find? William asked as they prepared to leave. Even if Ranger reacts to the post office, we don't have the key. We're following the breadcrumbs, Marshall explained. If we can confirm the post office connection, maybe we can track down which box it was. Rodriguez might still be renting it. And if he's not? Davis asked. Marshall's expression hardened. Then we find another way. But this is our lead, and we're following it. As Marshall helped Ranger into Davis's truck, he couldn't ignore the German shepherd's worsening condition. Each breath seemed more labored than the last, and the once powerful muscles trembled with the effort of even small movements. Dr. Collins had warned them this might happen, a rapid decline as the cancer progressed. Just a little longer, partner, Marshall murmured, settling Ranger on a blanket in the back seat. One last mission, then you can rest. The drive to Cedar Rapids was tense, everyone alert for patrol cars or unmarked vehicles that might indicate Thompson's people had spotted them. But they reached the city limits without incident, the late afternoon traffic providing welcome anonymity. The main post office was a solid brick building from the 1940s. Its lobby a high-ceilinged space with rows of brass P.O. boxes along one wall. Davis parked in a loading zone at the side entrance while William and Gloria circled the block once before finding a spot across the street. 20 minutes until closing, Davis noted, checking his watch. Let's make this quick. Getting Ranger from the truck to the building was a challenge. The old dog could barely stand, let alone walk the distance. In the end, Marshall simply gathered him in his arms, cradling him against his chest like a child. Ranger's weight, diminished though it was by illness, strained Marshall's aging back, but he refused Davis's offer to help. "I've got him," Marshall insisted. "He's my partner." The post office lobby was nearly empty, just a few last-minute customers collecting mail or purchasing stamps. Marshall carried Ranger directly to the wall of P.O. boxes, walking slowly past each section, watching for any reaction. "Anything?" Davis murmured, positioned nearby as if checking his own box. Marshall shook his head. Ranger remained alert but showed no particular interest in their surroundings. They had nearly reached the end of the row when William entered, giving them a subtle nod to indicate the street outside remained clear. "This isn't working." Marshall said quietly, disappointment weighing heavily on him. Maybe we're wrong about the post office connection. But as they turned to leave, a postal worker emerged from the back room, pushing a cart of packages. The man was in his 60s, heavy-set, with thinning hair and thick glasses, nothing remarkable about him, except for Ranger's sudden rigid attention. A low growl rumbled from the German shepherd's chest, the same alert he'd given at the car wash when spotting Rodriguez. His ears flattened, teeth bared in an unmistakable sign of recognition and warning. "Marshal," Davis breathed. "Look at his badge." The postal worker wore a standard name tag, Frank Alvarez, 35 years of service. "Alvarez," Marshall repeated, the name triggering a distant memory. He was in Rodriguez's file, listed as an associate, questioned during the initial investigation but never charged. The postal worker had noticed them now, his eyes widening first in confusion, then in unmistakable recognition as he spotted Ranger. The package he'd been about to shelve dropped from suddenly nerveless fingers. "Sir," William called, moving quickly to intercept as Alvarez turned to flee. "We'd like to ask you a few questions." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Alvarez reached beneath his postal uniform, pulling out a small revolver. Davis shouted a warning, shoving a startled customer out of the line of fire. William froze, hands raised in a placating gesture, and Ranger, old, sick, dying Ranger, surged from Marshall's arms with a strength born of desperate duty, launching himself directly at Alvarez. The gun discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet going wide as Ranger's weight connected with Alvarez's arm. Man and dog went down in a tangle of limbs and snarls, the revolver skittering across the polished floor. "Police!" Davis bellowed, drawing his own weapon as he rushed forward. "Everyone down!" Marshall reached the struggling pair just as Ranger's strength gave out, the German shepherd collapsing atop the now subdued Alvarez. Blood pooled beneath them, and for one heart-stopping moment Marshall thought Ranger had been shot. But it was Alvarez, bleeding, his forearm torn open by Ranger's last defensive bite. The postal worker lay stunned, all fight gone from him as Davis secured his hands behind his back with zip ties produced from a pocket. "Ranger!" Marshall called urgently, gathering the exhausted dog into his arms once more. "Ranger, look at me!" The German shepherd's eyes were glazed with pain and exhaustion, his breathing now a labored wheeze that shook his entire body. But he was alive, somehow still fighting. "Good boy," Marshall whispered, voice breaking. "Best partner anyone ever had." Gloria had appeared from somewhere, taking charge of the scene with the authority of her years in law enforcement. She directed the remaining customers away from the area, then approached Alvarez with cold fury. "Where's the key, Frank?" she demanded. "The one from the Rodriguez warehouse, P.O. Box key. Where is it?" Alvarez, pale from blood loss and shock, shook his head weakly. "Don't know what you're—" "Save it," Gloria snapped. "Your reaction when you saw the dog tells us everything. That key is evidence in a federal investigation. Withholding it is a felony." William had retrieved the revolver and now stood guard over Alvarez while Davis called in the incident, not to the Cedar Rapids police, but to an FBI contact Jennifer had provided. "Frank," Marshall said, still cradling Ranger, "my partner here doesn't have much time left. But he remembers you. He remembers what was under those floorboards. And he's not leaving until we find it." Something in Marshall's voice, the raw emotion, the unmistakable truth about Ranger's condition, seemed to reach Alvarez. The postal worker's eyes moved to the German shepherd, taking in the gray muzzle, the labored breathing, the evident pain. "I was just doing my job," he said finally. "Rodriguez paid me to maintain the box, collect the contents, keep it secure." "I didn't know what was in it. But you suspected," Marshall pressed, "especially after the raid." Alvarez nodded reluctantly. "The key is in my locker, box 1457. I've been maintaining it all these years just like I was paid to do. Even after Rodriguez went legitimate, the payments kept coming. Every month, cash, to keep that box active. "Who collects the contents?" William asked. "Different people. Never the same person twice. Last few years, it's mostly been cops." Alvarez's gaze shifted to Davis. "Thompson himself sometimes." Davis's expression hardened. "And you never thought to report this?" Alvarez gave a bitter laugh. "Report it to who? The cops who were collecting the documents? The feds who never followed up after the warehouse burned? I've got a family, a pension coming. I kept my head down, did what I was paid to do." While Gloria accompanied Davis to retrieve the key from Alvarez's locker, William helped Marshall move Ranger to a more comfortable position on a bench near the entrance. The German shepherd's condition was worsening by the minute, his breathing shallow, eyes struggling to stay open. "Hang on, boy," Marshall urged, stroking the graying head. "Just a little longer. We're so close." William, who had been keeping watch through the lobby windows, suddenly stiffened. "Dad," he said quietly, "we've got company." Marshall looked up to see two patrol cars pulling into the post office parking lot, lights flashing but sirens silent. Through the glass doors he could make out Chief Thompson himself emerging from an unmarked sedan, face set in grim determination. "They must have been monitoring the emergency channels," William surmised. "Heard about the shooting." Marshall nodded, mind racing through options. Davis and Gloria were still in the back, hopefully retrieving the key. Alvarez was secured but injured. And Ranger was dying. Marshall could feel it in the growing stillness of the body beneath his hands. See it in the dulling of those intelligent eyes that had always understood him so well. "Will," Marshall said, decision made. "Take Ranger out the side door. Get him to Dr. Collins. I'll handle Thompson." William started to protest, but Marshall cut him off. "He's fading fast. I won't let him die in a post office standoff. Get him to Sarah, now." After a moment of internal struggle, William nodded. Gently, he gathered Ranger into his arms, the German shepherd now too weak even to lift his head. "What about you?" William asked, already moving toward the side exit. Marshall stood, straightening to his full height, despite the pain in his back, the ache in his knees, the weight of his years. "I'm going to finish what we started." What Ranger started 7 years ago. As William disappeared through the side door with Ranger, Marshall turned to face the main entrance. Through the glass, he could see Thompson giving orders to his officers, pointing toward different entrances. The chief hadn't spotted him yet. There was still time to retreat, to follow William and Ranger to safety. But Marshal Reynolds had spent 30 years upholding the law, believing in justice. He wouldn't run now, not when they were so close to exposing the corruption that had separated him from his partner, that had cost Carl Simmons his life, that had allowed criminals to operate with impunity beneath the shield of a badge. So instead of fleeing, Marshall walked deliberately toward the main doors, pushing them open to step outside just as Thompson turned in his direction. Their eyes met across the parking lot, the corrupt chief and the retired K9 officer, and in that moment, Marshall knew with absolute certainty that only one of them would walk away from this confrontation with their freedom intact. "Reynolds," Thompson called, hand moving casually toward his sidearm. "Just the man I've been looking for." Marshall stood his ground, empty hands visible at his sides. "It's over, Thompson. We know about the post office box, about the evidence from the warehouse, about everything." Thompson's expression never wavered, but something cold and calculating flickered in his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about, old man, but you're interfering with an active police investigation. Step aside." Behind Thompson, his officers fanned out, hands on their weapons. Marshall recognized a few faces from his time on the force. Younger officers who might not understand what they were part of, who might genuinely believe they were just following orders. "Your officers deserve to know who they're really working for," Marshall said, raising his voice to carry across the parking lot. They deserve to know about the money laundering, the evidence tampering, the murder of an undercover FBI agent. A murmur ran through the assembled officers. Thompson's face darkened with anger. "That's enough, Reynolds. You're delusional, suffering from dementia. Stand down before someone gets hurt." Marshall stood his ground. "Carl Simmons, remember that name, officers. FBI agent murdered to cover up corruption in your department. His widow is prepared to testify." Thompson's control slipped, just for a moment, but it was enough. "Arrest him," he snapped to the nearest officer. "Obstruction of justice, interfering with police business." As two young officers approached cautiously, Marshall made no move to resist. This was part of the plan now, to create a public record, to force the evidence into the open where it couldn't be buried again. "Checkbox 1457, Marshall told them as they took his arms. "That's where you'll find the truth. That's what Thompson has been hiding for 7 years." The officers exchanged uncertain glances, their grip on Marshall's arms less than firm. Thompson, seeing their hesitation, strode forward, face flushed with barely controlled rage. "Get him out of here," he ordered. "Now!" But before the officers could comply, another vehicle pulled into the parking lot, an FBI tactical van followed by 2 unmarked sedans. Jennifer Simmons emerged from the first sedan, accompanied by a tall man in a suit who immediately began issuing orders to the agents deploying from the van. "Federal agents," the man announced, displaying his credentials. "Everyone stand down. Chief Thompson, you are being detained in connection with an ongoing federal investigation." Confusion erupted among the Cedar Rapids officers, some drawing weapons, others backing away from the confrontation. Thompson's hand moved to his sidearm, indecision warring with desperation on his face. "Don't," Marshall advised quietly. "It really is over, Robert. Ranger found the evidence." Again. For a moment it seemed Thompson might still resist. Then, with a deflating sigh, he raised his hands in surrender. "That damn dog," he muttered. "Should have had him put down years ago." The words struck Marshall like a physical blow. "You tried," he replied coldly. "But Ranger was always stronger than you gave him credit for. Smarter, too." As FBI agents secured Thompson and began explaining the situation to the bewildered Cedar Rapids officers, Jennifer hurried to Marshall's side. "William called," she explained breathlessly. "Said you needed backup. I contacted Carl's old handler. They've been building the case all along, just needed the final evidence." Marshall nodded, relief washing over him now that the immediate danger had passed. But that relief was short-lived as he remembered Ranger, struggling for each breath as William carried him away. "I need to go," he told Jennifer urgently. "Ranger's at Dr. Collins's clinic. He's not doing well." Jennifer's eyes filled with understanding. "Go. We'll handle things here." She pressed a set of car keys into his hand. "Take my car. It's the silver sedan." Marshall didn't need to be told twice. As FBI agents led Thompson toward one of their vehicles, as Gloria and Davis emerged from the post office with what must be the contents of box 1457, as justice finally began to unfold, Marshall Reynolds left it all behind, driven by a single, overwhelming need to be with his partner in what might be his final moments. The drive to Dr. Collins' clinic was a blur, traffic lights and stop signs barely registering as Marshall pushed Jennifer's sedan well beyond the speed limit. His mind filled with images of Ranger, young and vital in his working days, aged but determined in his final act of service, always loyal, always brave. "Hold on," Marshall whispered to the empty car. "I'm coming, partner. Just hold on." But as he pulled into the clinic's parking lot, he saw William sitting on the front steps, head in his hands, and Marshall knew, with a certainty that broke his heart, that he was already too late. Marshall's legs felt like lead as he approached his son. The world seemed to slow around him, sounds muffled as if he were underwater. William looked up, his face etched with grief, eyes red-rimmed and swollen. No words were needed. The truth was written in every line of his son's posture. "I'm sorry, Dad," William said, his voice hoarse. "He was struggling to breathe when we arrived. Dr. Collins did everything she could, but—" He shook his head, unable to finish. Marshall sank onto the step beside his son, a hollow emptiness expanding in his chest. Too late. After 7 years apart, after finally reuniting, after one last act of heroic service, he'd missed Ranger's final moments. "Was he in pain?" Marshall managed to ask, the words scraping his throat. William placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "No. Dr. Collins made sure of that. He was comfortable, peaceful." He paused, swallowing hard. "She said she'd wait for you before moving him." Marshall nodded, grateful for this small mercy. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before asking, "Did he know? At the end, did he know what he'd accomplished?" "I told him," William assured him. "I told him you were bringing Thompson down, that the evidence was secured, that he'd completed his mission. He understood, Dad. I know he did. His tail—" William's voice broke. "His tail wagged when I said your name." Something inside Marshall crumpled at this image, but he forced himself to stand, to face what came next. "I need to see him." The clinic was quiet, the staff having left for the day except for Dr. Collins, who met them in the reception area. Her professional composure was intact, but her eyes held genuine sorrow as she led them to a private room in the back. "I made him as comfortable as possible," she explained softly. "The cancer had spread to his lungs, his liver. Even without today's exertion, he likely had very little time left." Marshall barely heard her, his attention fixed on the still form lying on an examination table, covered with a soft blue blanket. Ranger looked peaceful, as if simply sleeping, his gray muzzle relaxed, the pain and struggle finally absent from his noble face. "Could I have a moment alone with him?" Marshall asked, his voice barely audible. Dr. Collins nodded, touching his arm gently before guiding William from the room. When the door closed behind them, Marshall approached the table, his steps unsteady. He reached out, hand trembling, to stroke the familiar head one last time. "Hey, partner," he whispered. "You did good today, the best, just like always." The fur beneath his fingers was still warm, creating a cruel illusion of life that made Marshall's chest constrict with fresh grief. He continued stroking Ranger's head, finding comfort in the familiar texture, the pattern of gray that had spread from his muzzle to his ears in the years they'd been apart. "I'm sorry I wasn't there at the end," Marshall continued, voice breaking. "Seems like I was always a step behind you today. One last time, you led the way." He smiled through gathering tears. "Remember how you always pulled on the leash during training? Never could break you of that habit. Always eager, always ready for the next challenge." Marshall pulled a chair close to the table and sat heavily, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. His hand never left Ranger's fur as memories washed over him. Their first meeting when Ranger was just an energetic 2-year-old recruit. Their training sessions in rain and snow and summer heat. The countless hours in patrol cars and crime scenes. The absolute trust that had developed between them. "You were the best part of my career," Marshall told him. "The best partner anyone could ask for. What we did today, what you did, it matters. Thompson's finished. The evidence is secure. Justice for Carl Simmons, for all the others they hurt." He leaned closer, pressing his forehead against Ranger's. "Rest easy now, boy. Mission complete." For long minutes, Marshall sat in silence, one hand resting on Ranger's head, the other over his heart, where no loyal beat remained. He wasn't sure how much time had passed when a soft knock sounded at the door. "Dad?" William called gently. "There's someone here to see you." Marshall straightened, wiping roughly at his eyes. "Not now, Will. Please." "It's important," his son insisted. "Trust me on this." Reluctantly, Marshall rose from his chair, placing a final kiss on Ranger's head before turning toward the door. When he opened it, he found William waiting with Jennifer and an unfamiliar man in a well-worn suit, his FBI credentials displayed on his lapel. "Marshall Reynolds?" the agent inquired, extending his hand. "Special Agent Daniel Portman. I was Carl Simmons's handler. I've waited a long time to thank you in person." Marshall shook the offered hand automatically, his grief-fogged mind struggling to process this new development. "Thank me?" "For finishing what Carl started," Portman explained. "The evidence from Box 1457 is the missing piece we've needed for years. Financial records, offshore account numbers, a complete list of everyone involved in the money laundering operation, combined with what Carl managed to document before his death, it's enough to bring down Thompson's entire network." Jennifer stepped forward, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Carl always believed you and Ranger were the key. That's why he arranged to adopt Ranger after his forced retirement. He knew the dog remembered something crucial." "And he was right," Portman confirmed. "Your partner is a hero, Mr. Reynolds. What he did today, what you both did, will dismantle one of the most entrenched corruption networks we've seen in Iowa." Marshall nodded, the words washing over him without fully penetrating the shield of his grief. "Ranger did the work," he said simply. "I just followed his lead." Portman seemed to understand, stepping back respectfully. "There will be time for formal statements later. For now, I just wanted you to know that Thompson and Rodriguez are both in custody, along with 3 other officers and 2 postal employees. The investigation is ongoing, but the core of the operation has been dismantled." "Thank you," Marshall managed, then glanced back at the room where Ranger lay. "If you'll excuse me." "Of course," Portman said. But Jennifer placed a gentle hand on Marshall's arm. "There's something else," she said softly. "Something I think you should see first." Confused, Marshall allowed himself to be led down the hallway to another examination room. "Doctor?" Collins stood waiting, her expression unreadable as she opened the door. Inside, lying on a blanket-covered table similar to the one where Ranger rested, was another German shepherd, younger but with the same distinctive markings, the same intelligent eyes that now turned toward the door at their entrance. "This is Faithful," Dr. Collins explained. "Ranger's grandson. He was being trained as a service dog, but failed the program due to his, shall we say, independent nature." A smile touched her lips. "Sound familiar?" Marshall stared at the dog, who regarded him with cautious interest. "I don't understand." Dr. Collins approached the table, stroking the young shepherd's head. "Before Carl died, he made arrangements. Tracked down a litter from Ranger's bloodline, specifically requested a pup that showed the same traits. Jennifer's been keeping him at a training facility until he was needed." "Carl believed in finishing what was started," Jennifer added softly. "He knew Ranger wouldn't live forever, but he wanted his legacy to continue." The young dog, Faithful, tilted his head, studying Marshall with an intensity that was achingly familiar. Then, as if making a decision, he rose from the table and approached, stopping directly in front of Marshall and sitting at perfect attention. "He's been waiting for you," Dr. Collins said. "For the right time." Marshall knelt slowly, meeting the shepherd's gaze at eye level. Unlike Ranger's cloudy eyes, dimmed by age and illness, Faithful's were clear and bright, filled with the same intelligence, the same unwavering focus. "Hello, Faithful," Marshall said, voice rough with emotion. The dog's ears perked forward at the sound of his name. After a moment's consideration, he extended his paw, placing it solemnly on Marshall's knee, a gesture so reminiscent of Ranger that Marshall's breath caught. "I think he approves of you," William observed quietly. Marshall looked from the dog to his son, to Jennifer, to Dr. Collins, struggling to process this unexpected development amidst his grief. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "Not so soon after." "No one's asking you to replace Ranger," Jennifer assured him. "No one could, but Faithful needs a purpose, and I think you might too." Marshall turned back to the young shepherd, who continued to watch him expectantly, paw still resting on his knee. Something about the dog's direct gaze, the patient stillness with which he waited for Marshall's decision, spoke of a wisdom beyond his years, as if something of Ranger's spirit lived on in this younger incarnation. "Carl had a saying," Jennifer continued, "that the best way to honor those we've lost is to carry forward what they began. Ranger started something important today." "Something that isn't quite finished." Marshall thought of the investigation still unfolding, the network of corruption being exposed, the justice that was finally being served. Ranger had completed his mission, yes, but the work itself continued. Slowly, hesitantly, Marshall reached out to touch Faithful's head. The young dog leaned into his hand, a soft whine escaping him. Not distress, but communication, connection. "What do you think, Will?" Marshall asked, not taking his eyes from Faithful. William moved to kneel beside his father, offering his own hand for the shepherd to sniff. "I think Emma would be thrilled," he said simply. "And I think you're not quite ready for retirement yet, despite what you tell yourself." A ghost of a smile touched Marshall's lips. "Like grandfather, like grandson, is that it?" "Something like that," William agreed. "Though I was talking about the dogs." For the first time since entering the clinic, Marshall felt something other than crushing grief, a faint spark of purpose, of possibility. It didn't diminish the loss of Ranger, didn't ease the pain of his absence, but it offered a path forward, a way to honor what they'd shared. "I'd need to move back to Cedar Rapids," Marshall mused, half to himself. "Get a place with a yard." "You could stay with us until you find something," William offered. "Emma would love the company while I'm at work." Marshall looked up, surprised. "You'd be okay with that? Having your old man underfoot?" "More than okay," William assured him, something vulnerable crossing his features. "Today made me realize how much time we've wasted, Dad. How many years we've spent distant from each other because of old hurts and misunderstandings." Marshall nodded, understanding completely. Losing Ranger had brought into sharp focus all the relationships he'd neglected, all the connections he'd allowed to wither through neglect or stubbornness. "Besides," William continued with a hint of his old humor, "someone needs to teach Emma how to train this beast properly. I certainly don't have the skills." Faithful, as if sensing he was being discussed, shifted his attention to William, giving his hand a dignified lick before returning his focus to Marshall, waiting, it seemed, for a decision. "What do you say, Faithful?" Marshall asked, using the tone he'd once reserved for Ranger during training. "Ready for a new mission?" The young shepherd's ears pricked forward, his posture straightening in unmistakable affirmation. It wasn't acceptance of a replacement. Nothing could ever replace Ranger, but perhaps the beginning of a new partnership, one that honored what came before while building something different, something healing. "I need to say goodbye first," Marshall said, rising with effort, his knees protesting the movement. "Properly." Dr. Collins nodded in understanding. "Take all the time you need. Faithful will be here when you're ready." Marshall returned to the quiet room where Ranger lay, still and peaceful in his final rest. For a long moment he simply stood beside his old partner, hand resting on the graying head, absorbing the finality of their separation. "Thank you," he whispered finally, "for everything, for your service, your loyalty, your friendship, for saving my life more than once." He swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. "And for bringing William back to me, for giving me a reason to keep going." Marshall removed his watch, an old-fashioned timepiece Linda had given him on their 20th anniversary, and carefully tucked it beneath Ranger's paw. A token to accompany him on his final journey, a piece of Marshall to carry forward. "Goodbye, partner," he said, voice breaking. "Rest well. You've earned it." When Marshall emerged from the room some minutes later, his eyes were red but dry, his posture straighter, as if a decision had been reached. William, Jennifer, and Dr. Collins waited in the hallway, Faithful sitting alertly at William's side. "I'd like to take him home," Marshall said, looking at the young shepherd. "If that's all right." Jennifer smiled through her tears. "That's exactly what Carl would have wanted." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Collins approached with Ranger's collar in her hands, worn leather with a tarnished badge still attached. "I thought you might want this," she said gently. "A remembrance." Marshall accepted the collar reverently, running his thumb over the smooth leather, the metal badge that had identified Ranger as part of the K9 unit. After a moment's contemplation, he knelt before Faithful. "This belonged to your grandfather," he explained, holding the collar where the young dog could sniff it. "One of the finest police dogs Cedar Rapids ever had. He served with honor, with courage, with unwavering loyalty." Faithful regarded the collar solemnly, nose working as he absorbed the scents embedded in the leather, Ranger's unique signature, perhaps, or simply the accumulated history of years of service. "This stays with me," Marshall continued, tucking the collar carefully into his pocket, "as a reminder of everything he was, everything he gave. But his spirit, his dedication, his heart, that's something we can carry forward together, if you're willing." The young shepherd tilted his head, considering, then stepped forward to press his muzzle against Marshall's hand. Acceptance, acknowledgement, agreement. Outside the clinic, the day was fading into evening, the sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. Agent Portman waited beside an unmarked car, his expression respectful as Marshall emerged with Faithful walking steadily at his side. "There will be hearings," Portman informed him. "Testimonies needed. The case against Thompson and the others is strong, but your first-hand account will be crucial." Marshall nodded, his hand dropping automatically to Faithful's head. "We'll be there. Whatever you need." "We?" Portman inquired, eyebrow raised as he glanced at the young shepherd. "My new partner," Marshall explained simply. "Ranger's legacy." Understanding dawned in the agent's eyes. "Of course. The Bureau would be honored to have both of you assist with the investigation." He hesitated, then added more softly, "I'm sorry about your loss, Mr. Reynolds. From everything Carl told me, Ranger was one of a kind." "He was," Marshall agreed, grief and pride mingling in his voice. "But his work continues." As Portman departed with promises to be in touch, Marshall turned to William. "What happens now?" His son smiled, a genuine warmth that reached his eyes. "Now we go home. Emma's waiting. Jennifer's arranged for Ranger to be—" He paused, searching for the right words. "To be taken care of with dignity. We can discuss the details tomorrow." Marshall nodded, grateful for his son's understanding, for the space to process his grief without immediate decisions. "And Faithful?" William glanced down at the young shepherd, who had positioned himself naturally at Marshall's left side, the traditional place for a K9 partner. "I think he's already made his choice clear." They walked together toward William's car, the setting sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. Marshall moved slowly, each step measured, his hand occasionally brushing Faithful's head as if reassuring himself of the dog's presence. It wasn't recovery, not yet. The wound of Ranger's loss was too fresh, too deep. But it was movement, a step forward on a path that honored what had been while acknowledging what might still be. As they drove toward William's home, Marshall gazed out the window at the familiar streets of Cedar Rapids, city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Beside him, Faithful sat alert, watching the passing scenery with the keen interest of youth. "Dad?" William ventured, glancing sideways as he drove. "Are you okay?" Marshall considered the question, its simplicity belying its complexity. Was he okay? No, not really. He had lost his partner twice, first to retirement, then to death. He had uncovered corruption in the department he'd served faithfully for 30 years. He had confronted his own mortality, his own limitations. But he had also reconnected with his son, discovered a granddaughter who shared his spirit, exposed a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. And now beside him sat a living link to Ranger, a new beginning disguised as an ending. "No," Marshall answered honestly, "but I will be. We will be." William nodded, understanding the depth beneath the simple words. "One day at a time," he suggested. "One day at a time," Marshall agreed, his hand finding Faithful's head in the gathering darkness. The young shepherd leaned into his touch, solid and real and present, not a replacement for what was lost, but a continuation of something valuable, something worth preserving. As they turned onto William Street, Marshall felt Ranger's collar in his pocket, a tangible reminder of the partner who had given everything in service, in loyalty, in love. The grief would remain, would always be part of him now. But alongside it, growing slowly like the first tender shoots after a forest fire, was something else. Purpose, connection, possibility. "Home," William announced as they pulled into the driveway. Marshall gazed at the house, warm light spilling from its windows, Emma's silhouette visible as she raced to the door upon hearing their arrival. Beside him, Faithful sat up straighter, sensing the importance of the moment. "Home," Marshall echoed, the word carrying new weight, new meaning. Not just a location, but a state of being. Not just a building, but the people within it. Not just an ending, but a beginning. Together, father, son, granddaughter, and a young shepherd carrying an old legacy, they stepped toward the waiting doorway, toward whatever came next in this unexpected chapter of an ongoing story. 1 year later, on a warm October morning, Marshall Reynolds stood beside a simple granite marker in Cedar Rapids Memorial Gardens. The stone bore no elaborate inscription, just a name, 2 dates, and the words, "Loyal Partner, Faithful Friend." At his side, Faithful sat in perfect attention, his coat gleaming in the autumn sunlight, a dignified presence as his grandfather's grave received its final addition, a small bronze plaque officially recognizing K9 Rangers' service to the Cedar Rapids Police Department. "Took them long enough," Tommy Davis commented, standing a respectful distance away with William and Emma. Marshall smiled faintly. Better late than never. The past year had transformed Cedar Rapids law enforcement. With Thompson and his network exposed, the department had undergone a complete overhaul, new leadership, new policies, new transparency measures. Among these changes was the formal acknowledgement of K9 officers' contributions, including those who, like Ranger, had been forced into early retirement under the old regime. The small ceremony today marked the culmination of that recognition. A quiet affair attended only by those who had been part of Ranger's final mission. No press, no speeches, just a simple moment of remembrance for a dog who had served beyond the call of duty. "He would have hated all the fuss," Marshall observed, reaching down to adjust the small bouquet of flowers Emma had placed on the grave earlier. "Never did like ceremonial nonsense." William smiled, stepping forward to place a hand on his father's shoulder. "Unlike Faithful here, who seems to thrive on attention." As if understanding the comparison, Faithful tilted his head, his expression somehow managing to convey dignified disagreement. At 2 years old, the young shepherd had grown into a striking animal, his posture and bearing clearly showing his police dog lineage despite never having formal canine training. "He's got his own style," Marshall conceded with affection. In the year since Ranger's death, Faithful had become his constant companion, a bridge between past and present. Not a replacement, Marshall was careful never to think of him that way, but a continuation, a living connection to the partner he had lost. Emma approached the grave, her 11-year-old solemnity giving way to a more characteristic exuberance as she turned to her grandfather. "Can we show him now, Grandpa? Please?" Marshall exchanged a glance with William, who nodded permission. "Go ahead, sweetheart." With ceremonial gravity, Emma removed a folded newspaper from her jacket pocket and carefully opened it to reveal a headline. "Governor signs Ranger's Law, Protecting Retired Police K9’s." "It's official as of yesterday," William explained. All retired K9 officers in Iowa now have the legal right to remain with their handlers. The department must cover medical care for life, and if the handler can't keep the dog for any reason, they have input on placement. Marshall stared at the headline, emotion tightening his throat. It had been a long fight, with testimonies before state legislators, lobbying efforts, and countless meetings. Jennifer had been instrumental, using her late husband's FBI connections to push the bill forward, but seeing it finally signed into law, bearing Ranger's name no less, brought a sense of completion Marshall hadn't realized he needed. "He'd be proud," Davis said quietly. "They both would, Ranger and Carl." Jennifer, who had been standing slightly apart from the group, moved forward to place her own tribute at the grave. A small, weathered tennis ball, the kind Carl had used when working with Ranger during his years of patient investigation. "Carl always said Ranger was the smartest dog he'd ever met," she remarked, straightening up with a wistful smile. "Said he understood things no dog should be able to understand." Marshall nodded, remembering Ranger's uncanny perception, his almost human comprehension of complex situations. He was one of a kind. The small gathering observed a moment of silence, each lost in private thoughts and memories. Then, with quiet farewells, they began to disperse. Davis to a fishing appointment, Jennifer to her volunteer work with the K9 advocacy group she now headed, William to his shift at the hospital. "Coming, Dad?" William asked, car keys in hand. Marshall shook his head. "In a bit. I'd like a few more minutes here." William nodded in understanding. "We'll meet you at the house. Emma's making her famous spaghetti for dinner." "Wouldn't miss it," Marshall promised. As the others departed, Marshall remained beside the grave, faithful, a warm presence against his leg. The past year had brought more changes than just the legislation. Marshall had purchased a small house not far from Williams, with a fenced yard where Faithful could run and a spare bedroom that had gradually filled with Emma's books and toys for her frequent overnight visits. More significant than the physical changes, though, were the relational ones. The wall that had stood between Marshall and William for so many years had crumbled, replaced by a tentative bridge that grew stronger with each passing month. They still had their moments of tension, old habits died hard, but there was a new foundation of respect and understanding that sustained them through the difficult conversations. "You'd hardly recognize the place now, partner," Marshall told the granite marker, continuing a one-sided conversation he'd been having throughout the year. "New chiefs, making real changes. Remember Garcia, the rookie who was always asking questions about K9 work? She's heading the new K9 unit. Got 6 dogs now, all living with their handlers." Faithful's ears perked up at the mention of other dogs, his attention momentarily shifting to a squirrel darting across a nearby grave before returning to Marshall with characteristic focus. "And William," Marshall shook his head in wonder. "You wouldn't believe how we're doing, Ranger. Sunday dinners every week, fishing trips with Emma. He even comes to my physical therapy appointments sometimes, fusses over me like I'm the child." He chuckled softly. Linda would be so happy to see it. The mention of his late wife brought a familiar ache, but it was tempered now by the knowledge that he was honoring her greatest wish, reconciliation with their son. Marshall often thought about how strange it was that it had taken Ranger's death to finally break through the walls he and William had built between them. But perhaps that was fitting. Ranger had always been good at finding what was hidden, at breaking through barriers. The Rodriguez case is officially closed, Marshall continued his update. Final sentencing was last month. Thompson got 20 years. Rodriguez rolled on his suppliers for a reduced sentence, but he'll still be inside for a decade at least. He paused, absently scratching Faithful behind the ears. Agent Portman says the evidence from Box 1457 ended up exposing corruption in 3 other departments across the state. Your last case turned out to be your biggest old friend. The autumn breeze rustled through nearby trees, sending a shower of golden leaves drifting across the cemetery. One settled on Ranger's marker, and Marshall left it there, a natural tribute to a life lived in service. "I'm not sure I ever properly thanked you," he said more softly, "not just for solving the case, but for everything else, for bringing William back into my life, for Emma, for giving me purpose again when I thought that part of my life was over." Faithful nudged Marshall's hand with his nose, sensing the emotional shift in his human companion. Marshall smiled down at him, grateful for the reminder that he wasn't alone. "And for him," Marshall added, "for sending me a new partner when I needed one most." As if on cue, Faithful stood, stretching briefly before assuming the alert posture that indicated he was ready to move on. It was a gesture so reminiscent of Ranger that Marshall felt the familiar pang, not as sharp as it once had been, but present nonetheless. "You're right," he told the young shepherd. "Time to go home." With a final touch to the granite marker, Marshall turned away from the grave, Faithful falling naturally into step beside him. They walked together through the cemetery, past monuments both grand and humble, toward the small parking area where Marshall's truck waited. The vehicle itself was new, well, new to Marshall at least. A practical SUV with plenty of room for Faithful in the back, and modifications that accommodated Marshall's sometimes troublesome knees. Another change in a year full of them. As they drove through Cedar Rapids, Marshall found himself taking the long route, past landmarks that held significance in his life with Ranger. The old K9 training facility, now converted into a community center. The park where they'd tracked a lost child through a summer storm. The rebuilt site where the Rodriguez warehouse had once stood, now a small grocery store serving the neighborhood. Each location held memories, some painful, some proud, all part of the tapestry that had woven his life with Rangers for those 8 crucial years. Marshall no longer avoided these places as he once had, no longer felt the sharp sting of loss when passing them. Now they were simply parts of his history, chapters in a story that continued to unfold. They arrived at William's house to find Emma on the front porch, homework spread around her as she enjoyed the mild autumn day. She looked up at the sound of Marshall's truck, her face lighting with a smile that never failed to warm his heart. "Grandpa, did you show Ranger the newspaper? Do you think he knows?" Marshall climbed carefully from the vehicle, releasing Faithful from his harness in the back. "I showed him. And yes, I think he knows." Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer. At 11, she straddled the line between childhood belief and adult understanding, still young enough to imagine Ranger watching from somewhere beyond, old enough to grasp the significance of the legislation bearing his name. "Dad's on the phone with the hospital," she reported as Marshall settled into the porch swing beside her. "Some emergency with his schedule. He said to tell you dinner might be a little late." "That's fine," Marshall assured her, glancing at the textbook open on her lap. "History homework?" Emma nodded. "We're studying important laws and how they get made. I asked if I could do my report on Ranger's Law, and Mrs. Peterson said yes." Her expression turned thoughtful. "Do you think Ranger knows he made history? That other police dogs get to stay with their people because of him?" Marshall considered the question, touched by her perception. "I think he'd be more concerned with the dogs than the history books. That was always his way, focused on what mattered most." "Like Faithful?" Emma observed, watching as the young shepherd patrolled the perimeter of the yard, his movements precise and purposeful. "He doesn't care about being famous either." "No," Marshall agreed, "though he wouldn't mind an extra treat for dinner." Emma giggled, the sound bringing William to the doorway, phone still in hand but conversation apparently concluded. "What's so funny out here?" he asked, smiling at the sight of his daughter and father seated companionably on the porch swing. "Grandpa says Faithful wants extra treats for being in the newspaper," Emma explained. William raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Well, I suppose we could make an exception considering the occasion." He glanced at his watch. "Dinner in 30. Emma, can you set the table? I need to talk to Grandpa for a minute." As Emma gathered her homework and headed inside, William took her place on the swing, his expression turning more serious. "Everything okay at the hospital?" Marshall asked, recognizing the look. William nodded. "That was actually Dr. Collins. She wanted to let us know the shelter received another German shepherd yesterday. Older female, retired from a K9 unit in Nebraska. Owner died suddenly, no family to take her." Marshall felt a familiar tug at his heart. "How old?" 7. "Still healthy, but the shelter's worried about placing her because of her age." William studied his father's face. "Collins thought you might want to know given your involvement with the K9 advocacy group." Since Ranger's death, Marshall had become increasingly active in the organization Jennifer headed, helping place retired working dogs with suitable families, advocating for their care, and occasionally fostering one himself while a permanent home was found. "What's her training?" Marshall asked, already mentally rearranging his schedule. "Bomb detection. Collins says she's well behaved, good with people, but struggling with the shelter environment." William hesitated. "I told her you'd stop by tomorrow to meet her. Was that presumptuous?" Marshall shook his head, touched by his son's understanding. "Not at all. I'll go first thing in the morning." "You're not thinking of adopting her yourself, are you?" William asked cautiously. "Faithful's still young, full of energy. An older dog might find him overwhelming." Marshall glanced across the yard where Faithful had completed his patrol and now sat alertly near the steps, ever watchful. "No, not adoption, but fostering maybe, just until we find the right place for her." He smiled faintly. "Ranger would want us to look out for her." William didn't argue, knowing better than to challenge the invocation of Ranger's wishes. Instead, he simply squeezed his father's shoulder before rising. "I should check on Emma and the spaghetti. Fire hazard. Those two together." As William disappeared inside, Marshall remained on the porch swing, watching the last of the daylight fade from the sky. Faithful approached, resting his head on Marshall's knee in a gesture that always reminded him of Ranger. "What do you think, boy?" Marshall asked softly. "Room for one more lost soul?" Faithful's expressive eyes seemed to consider the question seriously before he gave a soft whine of what Marshall chose to interpret as approval. "That's what I thought," Marshall said, scratching behind the shepherd's ears. "We'll go meet her tomorrow. No commitments, just an introduction." Inside the house he could hear Emma laughing, the clatter of dishes as the table was set. The domestic sounds of family life that had been absent from his world for too long. A year ago, he couldn't have imagined this. A home, a purpose, a family reconnected, a new partner at his side. All because of one dog who had refused to forget, who had completed his mission against all odds. "Thank you, Ranger," Marshall whispered to the evening sky. "For everything." Faithful nudged his hand again, then trotted up the steps toward the front door, looking back expectantly. Dinner was waiting. Family was waiting. Life was waiting. Marshall rose from the swing and followed, each step carrying him further from the past and into a future built on the foundation of what had been lost and what had been found. A future shaped by loyalty, by service, by love, the very qualities Ranger had embodied throughout his life. As he crossed the threshold into the warm light of William's home, Marshall felt a sense of completion, of coming full circle. The journey that had begun with heartbreak, a forced separation, years of loneliness, a bittersweet reunion, had transformed into something he never could have anticipated. Healing, connection, purpose. Ranger's legacy lived on, not just in the law that bore his name, not just in the granite marker with its bronze plaque, but in the lives he had touched and changed forever. In Marshall, finding his way back to family. In William, learning to forgive and be forgiven. In Emma, carrying forward a passion for justice and compassion. In Faithful, continuing a tradition of loyalty and service. And tomorrow, perhaps, in an aging shepherd from Nebraska who deserved the same second chance that had been given to them all. The door closed behind Marshall, shutting out the gathering darkness as he joined his family for dinner. Outside, the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, silent witnesses to endings and beginnings, to partings and reunions, to the enduring bond between a man and his dog that had transcended time, separation, and even death itself. The mission was complete, but the story continued. A testament to loyalty, courage, and the power of a faithful heart. In life's twilight chapters, we often find our greatest redemption stories. Marshall's journey with Ranger reminds us that it's never too late to heal old wounds and forge new connections. Like many of you, Marshall faced the bittersweet reality of retirement, strained family relationships, and the loss of purpose that defined his younger years. Yet through Ranger's unwavering loyalty, even in their final moments together, he discovered that endings can become beautiful beginnings. How many of us have let pride or past hurts keep us from reconciling with family? How many opportunities for connection have we missed while dwelling on what was lost? Ranger's legacy teaches us that our most meaningful contributions might still lie ahead, that the wisdom of our years has value, and that love transcends all boundaries, even time and death itself. The bond between Handler and K9 mirrors our own deepest relationships, built on trust, tested by adversity, and ultimately unbreakable. Has a special animal helped you through difficult times in your life? What relationships are you hoping to repair before it's too late? Share your stories in the comments, because like Marshall, we all have chapters yet unwritten, connections waiting to be restored, and faithful hearts ready to guide us home.